Hello. Wow, such a wondrous glowing lighting. Welcome to Vision Denial. My name is Sam, and this is World Watch and the highlight videos, mashup videos. Over the last 6 weeks, I had made weekly videos where I discuss my thoughts watching every single playoff game, yes, including that one, of all 11 participating regions. Those have come and gone, and I'm still working on some other videos at this moment, highlighting each and every team to give a quick introduction. But in the meantime, as I'm still working on that, I thought, not quick, but simpler, I will just put in large videos of the highlights, and I'll be putting a multitude of them, one for all of the playoffs in order of how they appeared, and one for each region in order of how they appeared. If you look at the title, that's the video you're watching. So, without further ado, let's just get to the first one. Starting with, we start the first series of summer, the first best of 5 in LLA, Latin America, with Impunity versus All Knights. And as the first best of 5 series of the summer, this one could have been worse. It really could have been. There's some glimmers of interesting things happening. Impunity, for one, are very well aware of their win conditions and how to start setting up for certain neutral objectives. But it's fairly rushed, it's often disjointed, or left to the wayside in favor of, some plays that had zero setup at all. On the other hand, All Knights show some individual prowess amongst their players and some fantastic team fighting that helped save some of their games from being totally one-sided. But I find myself wondering how well All Knights would do if they had been more coordinated outside of their team fights. That having just a little bit more initiative, they found themselves really waiting off and hoping for a mistake out of the side of Impunity. On the other hand, neither team really had anything stand out from their vision game. And Impunity, who won 3-0, never kept any gold lead or ballooned it throughout. In fact, regularly losing them fairly handedly. Now, the standouts of this particular series are from Impunity, Chowny and Solid Snake, who, at the center of it, were equal parts the reasons for their leads and how they lost them, as both of them would charge in and opt in for fights that frankly should not have been chosen. Impunity, as they stand currently during this, as what I saw from this best of 5 in the playoffs, don't look like world contenders, especially not for the LLA. But that could change if they start to fix a lot of their overzealous fight approaches and properly stick to their draft choices. With that, we just have to look for the next series. Up next, yes, we are still in the LLA. We've got Estral versus Team Aze, and I think the series is a little bit of better quality, mostly from the team that won. Now, if you were to tell me that Estral are the ones that qualify for Worlds in the future, I would not be surprised. This team showed some excellent approach to neutrals, vision, and early game pressure, much more than how they played in the spring playoffs. I would hope that their Game 1 play translated to the other two afterwards, where we found them being a little bit more brash and overzealous with their play. But, given how their opponents came in, it didn't make much of a difference. Ace, however, for their part, slightly baffled me. A lot of their coordination they showed us in spring have been completely lost. They showed some very poor vision play, made no strides to approach the win conditions they drafted, and often committed on some plays that were usually very high risk for very low reward. Looking at you specifically, Dimitri, who, despite his strides on trying to gain control of the momentum and was really the driving force of how their team's approach to the game really counted, really made some choices that I think were largely questionable. It's super unfortunate too because the bot duo of Ace were also major shining stars for this team, especially across the series. And the team recognized this as they regularly drafted for them. And, like, they just never played around them consistently. Game 3, they did try it, but it was some very lackluster approaches, which is really unfortunate. Now, standouts for this particular series are for Aze and Boogie, who really enabled much of how Estral won these different fights, how they approached the neutral setups, and the overall pressure that they were applying against Ace. It was really impressive, especially from Aze, who I hope they would give him more than just tanks, but he really makes a lot of work with how he uses the tanks for the teams. I'm hoping to see how Estral fare against a team that properly tracks Boogie in the early game and has a much stronger sense of priority on how to approach neutral objectives and visions, as there's literally nothing here that punished them in any way, shape, or form. And what we saw from Estral was great, but I'm not entirely sure this would make them world contenders. So let's see what's next with... We have, over here back in Latin America, Isirus Gaming versus Rainbow 7 in a nice 5-game series. The first 5-game series here for the summer playoffs. Although, mixed feelings about this particular series. Now, there is something to be said about some continuous improvement during a series. To me, it is a good sign for teams who want to go to Worlds to show some form of adaptation when approaching their best of fives, as how much time you have to adjust during the tournament is rather limited. Both teams here showed that concept, but not incredibly well. Rainbow 7 were the most proactive team during this entire series, but lost that kind of proactivity over time as Isirus got more and more proactive with time. They had like an inverse curve effect here. And both teams here showed moments of brilliance with their setups and vision, but they tend to revolve a lot of their plays around, and the pacing of their game around neutral objectives, as opposed to continuously accelerating the game. The vision was super inconsistent, and the approach of the neutrals were lackluster at best, despite some of their moments of brilliance. Now, that said, Isirus Gaming did show a stronger aptitude around playing for their win conditions and drafting something that had very clear goals, while Rainbow 7 drafted a lot of awkward compositions, leading to a lot of upwards battles, even in games where they were severely ahead or found really solid avenues to play around. Especially for Game 5, I cannot wrap my head around the fact that in Game 5, you would pick such narrow engage options, and also Seo, and to every marksman, every bot laner, stop picking Vayne. To me, that just tells me that you are saying you are so much better than your opponent, you will rock them against somebody that is, with a champion that is just garbage for the vast majority of like the playtime. And it showed, because they had a hard time, even in this Game 5, to really get the ball rolling with it. Now, as it stands here, neither team here looked to match the same kind of energy that Estral showed on the previous series yesterday. But Isirus Gaming looked pretty prepped to show the same kind of continuous improvement they had in spring for this particular playoffs, and that's nice. Standout players for me are the duo on the bot side of Gavoto and Jelly, who played out of their minds to the margins at all possible moments. And a lot of the plays, the way that they were able to navigate them, increased a lot of the margins of success that many of these plays should have gone wrong, or a lot of the ways that they've been dove on should have gone wrong for them. I was very excited to watch Isirus Gaming in spring, and they continue to show the same kind of approach here, and I hope to see the improvement all the way to Worlds. So let's take a look at the next series. We now go to Brazil with the CBLOL, as we have in the lower bracket Kabum Esports versus the Miners. And holy fuck, this was one-sided. Excusing the swearing of any sort, the skill difference between both of these teams was as clear as night and day. At every level of play, vision, teamfight, draft, any approach to neutrals, even the approach to the win conditions, just huge gap in skill difference between both of these teams. Kabum had the Miners' number at every turn. Now, this felt more like a series in which the Miners were more than the clear underdogs, right? Taking a look at this, many people would have favored Kabum to win over the Miners, but I don't think this was like this much of a level, if not more. Kabum showed up and looked good, but how good are they actually versus them having an easy series is kind of hard to like really measure given this gap. In situations like these, we need to look at things that are measurable independently of the opponent to properly gauge the kind of scenario they'll have further into the series. For one, their vision playing alone was fairly solid. There are moments in which some of their vision was a little shallow, but as they found clever draft solutions around their shallow play and had very solid leads in which they just kind of like hugely blew up the way that they approached the vision, most of those issues disappeared. But they also benefited largely from the lack of any contest around neutrals or around anything ever during these games, making it super clear that the real challenge will come when Kabum faces off against the top 4 in the Brazilian region. And that this was just merely, pomp and circumstance for lack of a better term. Now, special attention should be given to House and Wiz, who honestly navigated the very limits of what they could in a lot of these fights so excellently that they're both so fun to watch. If you have any time, watch it just for those two alone. And with that, we'll go see the next series that comes up with. We're in Brazil with the CBLOL's Pain Gaming versus Furia Esports. And this was the hyped match of the whole playoff for the first round. And not to lie, this definitely started out with a bang. Now, where Furia was definitely an early game powerhouse, they completely lacked the coordination to play out and end their games once the late game rolled around. The lack of ability to play outside neutral fights, inconsistent late game vision, questionable macro decisions, all of that made for an unfortunate team who showed such strong promise from their early games. Pain Gaming, on the other hand, is a rather slow team, a little bit more methodical on their end. They understood where their win conditions lay and how to get there. The issue, however, is how easily they would find themselves playing from behind, making me wonder how they will approach teams on the international stage if it gets there. Most teams won't give them the chance to scale. Now, Pain Gaming show a lot of signs of hesitation and feel like a team that excels at punishing mistakes instead of forcing them. And that doesn't bode well for any international prospects, which is super unfortunate given how measured and controlled they were. Now, the match from Kabum played previously yesterday, their best of 5, had me with some high hopes for the top 4 seeds of CBLOL, but here with seed 1 and seed 3 playing some rather sloppy late game, it won't matter how solid either your win condition approach or your win condition approach or your early game is. You'll just get eaten alive. Notable mentions go to Trigo and Dainquero, who regularly found ways to survive and maximize damage in a lot of these very chaotic and tunnel vision team fights that happened around neutral objectives and around dives. Rather surprising Honestly, this best of 5 is worth watching for the team fights alone and how some of these players maximize the amount of time they're alive to get as much damage out as possible and survive. Really solid stuff. Up next, we're going to watch. We have Team Aze versus Impunity from Latin America's LLA. I hope you have good heart medication because Dimitri is going to give me a heart attack. Impunity, during the series, looked like the more stable but shy team. Never properly establishing vision in any aggressive manner, but really there for some very defensive vision. Coordinated for the team fights and what the next move will be. But it seems like they never played to win the games, just more to not lose. Meanwhile, Ace would have the most aggressive vision play, wildest approaches to team fights, reckless abandon for how they approach their neutral objectives, all in the hopes to find the winning play. Very low percent success, but high value approach to the game. And honestly, very exciting to watch, but largely it leaves many to pick up where the mistakes lie. Dimitri and Lonely find huge openings only to jump way ahead, leaving the remaining trio to fend for themselves. And they managed to do it. Kudo to 5Kid and Straight, who had to do a lot of heavy lifting across all 4 games. Now, this isn't to say that Dimitri and Lonely are bad players or the decisions cost them the game, but looking towards Worlds, this kind of playstyle is either going to net you a lot of surprise wins or hefty losses from the giants of the legacy regions. Which is something to really think about, especially given how often a lot of these fights and successes start with Dimitri dying, leaving Ace on a disadvantage, only for one of the other players to come up really big on the win because the other team was just not playing up to snuff. Things to think about regarding that. But from that, I don't think Ace is going to do very well if they do manage to Worlds. But this is still the lower bracket. They would have a lot to go, and I don't expect them to do very well near the tail end of it. With that, let's take a look at the next one. We've got, out of CBLOL in Brazil, Loud versus Red Canids Kalunga. And what a pleasant series. I'm pleasantly surprised by the gradual improvement out of Loud. As each game moved on, their vision play was fuller, approach to neutral objectives was more consistent, wave manipulation was stronger and stronger every go. Best of all, they showed some nice adaptation during their drafts. Not something I could say from Red, as they couldn't find themselves a draft that worked for their playstyle and would end up giving limited space for Titan to operate under, and a lot of their win conditions towards Hugo and Greftar, who unfortunately would regularly struggle against Robo and Tinones, respectively. Now, the Canids find themselves in the lower bracket, and if they don't manage to adapt from their weaknesses, they'll be left behind very easily. And I can't stop to reiterate how it was just so nice to see a team that so casually improved from game to game in a series. It is something that is actively looked over and should be looked at in terms of like teams that are going to excel in into the international stage. That said, the aforementioned skill difference between the laners made up a large portion on how some of these fights finished. There's an underlying lack of coordination during team fights out of Loud and some of their neutral objectives that left me a little worried. Moments where Brance and Robo are clearly out of position during a fight, but they are expecting almost that the gold/skill difference will make the cut for these fights. And as much as it did here, that won't fly as well against Pain or even on the international stage. Now, shout out to Croquet and Seos, who controlled the flow and the zones out of these team fights so excellently, if not a little slow to the reaction. Take a look at the next game. We hit the LLA with Estral Esports versus Isirus Gaming. And this had a lot of excitement to it and some concerns. Now, Estral managed to show a larger amount of team fight coordination, awareness of how to use neutral objectives, wave management, vision play, but it always seemed like Isurus were on the offensive and holding the tempo lead. Now, Estral used that very well to their advantage, and when they did have control of the tempo, they forced mistakes out of Isurus very cleanly. I very much appreciate that it wasn't just them waiting for mistakes. They did, once having full control, forced the mistakes out and held tempo cleanly. Now, the lack of proactivity up until they get that control gets to a point where it concerns me, especially looking out to Worlds, where if in the early game you're not that kind of proactive, you're just going to get steamrolled on. Now, Isurus, on their hand, show a lot of their gutso and proactive mindset, and it really helped them, especially in Game 2, when they had full control of every aspect of the game from start to finish. But looking back at the lack of consistent vision, haphazard map movement, lack of overall team fight coordination, and how easily their early game falls apart from their laning phase differences from lane to lane, makes it hard for me to see this team win the LLA spot at Worlds, especially given how much this team excited me for spring. This is a little disappointing. Both teams have shown, some concern, but Estral over here, being the most consistent so far, shows me a lot of confidence if they were to be the reps of this region. I just want to see them be a little bit more proactive of the tempo of the game early in and less reactive and waiting for mistakes from their teams. Now, shout out to Kindless and Mireille, who managed to work well with their limits to control the map, or control their map space during team fights in a way that kept the Estral ahead most of the time, even as Boogie was king of the show, really popping off. Let's take a look at the next series. We're in Australia, or technically Oceania, with the LCOs, Order versus Pentanet GG. This is a really weird series. Honestly, very recommended. Not for necessarily the reasons of them being the best, but, you'd think the team with the stronger vision and neutral objective approach, some better applications to the early game, and strong understanding on how to nullify their opponent's draft, and some fairly strong laners, would be the strongest team, right? Well, Pentanet over here would not be the case. What was almost a reverse sweep, Pentanet GG really put their hearts and soul into 5 early game drafts that had some good potential, and only one version of them really worked out for 2 games. And really putting some doubts on how Order were going to win the series itself, especially since the strong opening Order put in. Now, Order really looked like they had Pentanet's number. Their draft overall were stronger and had more safety tools for scaling and neutral fights. And honestly, I really liked how Order approached their drafts game by game. But draft is not the end-all be-all, especially if your vision and wave management just make any individual lead that is garnered mute, as Pentanet gained the difference thanks to those weaknesses. Now, this was a rather close series and a lot of fun to watch, especially for some of the more unorthodox compositions brought out. I'm talking about Soraka top and Zillion top. Some good shit. Though, I'm more concerned that if either of these teams qualify for Worlds, their glaring weaknesses are glaring, and they'll be easily exploited. Both these teams have time to improve before either make it to the potential finals, And shout out especially to Biopanther and Winterer, who were good sports at fronting the more unorthodox picks for their teams had to play, notably the Soraka and Zillion top. Well, let's take a look at the next series then. The first playoff of the LPL, and it's a 5-game confusion. Take a look at Fun Plus Pheonix versus Oh My God or OMG. And yeah, I've got lots of questions, but honestly, because OMG showed such strong potential with the way that they handled the early game in such a dominant fashion, only for them to regularly fumble the mid to late game and give lots of opportunities for Fun Plus to come back in any of the games. Now, that would be concerning, but what's really worse is how Fun Plus managed to be wildly passive for so much of this series, only waiting until the absolute pivotal moments to come back. And only once OMG kept making mistakes. Now, that said, the passivity of Fun Plus is something I can see disappearing over time, especially given the last 2 games that they played. I'm honestly surprised by the Jekyll and Hyde impression that this team made, as the aggro was really turned up in the last 2 games. The coordination was cleaner, the team forced mistakes instead of waiting for them, and this is especially true of the last game of the series. I'm mostly concerned as they move up into the bracket that the higher seeded opponents won't give them the time of day to ramp up and get comfortable with it. Especially not during any individual games, let alone this series, and they'll likely just take them out fairly early and properly. But if they don't, the way that Fun Plus tended to improve across this series itself, allowing especially in the last 2 games where the approach to vision was much cleaner, neutral objectives were handled a lot better, I can see them going the distance here, kind of similarly how they managed to deal with spring of 2021. Now, I'm not convinced that'll be the case, but I can see it. Shout out to Clid and Care, who really played up their approach to teamfights in a way that was rather suffocating and handled the area of the map very well, as making sure that their engages were on point and that the damage output was maximized. Let's take a look at the next series. And we're back to Oceania with the LCO. Our match here, elimination match specifically. Wow, words. We've got KANGA Esports, a relative newcomer to the LCO, versus Direwolves, a long-standing org. This was rather interesting. I was surprised and entertained both positively and negatively in this particular series. Now, KANGA show a great understanding of their win conditions with their power spikes, or where their power spikes go, and map movement. And it's such a shame that individuals across the board make such consistent positional errors that are so easily punished by the Direwolves. Now, the Direwolves, for their part, mostly waited on the mistakes of their opponents to get anywhere, which is why they likely lost in such a way, only having really one game that was really impressive that took way too long for either team to win. Now, despite their positional errors, I found myself at a loss on their solid map movement but poor vision denial. It made what was super clear understanding of their approach to just where they needed to go onto the map turn into really sloppy decision making quite quickly out of the side of KANGA. Those are the 2 critical sins that KANGA Esports put forth as the otherwise very clean and one-sided set of games they played. I do think they had great drafts, decent enough vision control, and solid team fighting, but do I think this is enough? This is like a world-class caliber team? No. But I do think we'll give the top 3 seeded teams of the LCO a run for their money with the high-octane approach that they have. But only if they don't fumble through each engage as they happen. Now, shout out to Fighto and Limos, who honestly do a lot. Like, just do the most amount of damage out of the time they stay alive during these rather chaotic fights. And if there's anything this series will show, they're a lot of fun for the chaotic fights. Not necessarily high quality ones, but very chaotic and fun ones. Also, a bonus shout out to Benvi, who, even if he had the most amount of positional errors here, found some of the most interesting engage angles. Really good shit. Up next, let's take a look at it. Into the LPL from China, we've got LNG Esports. This is Bilibili Gaming. And this went from exciting to confusing really quickly. This is one of those series that leaves your head scratching. The first two games are near flawless from LNG. Solid pacing, ballooning leads that are like incredibly well, some solid vision, and while their neutrals and side lane pressure wasn't consistent, you could tell they knew how to approach the game in their favor to get the win conditions they needed. Then game 3 and 4 comes along, and Bilibili Gaming, BLG, says that the mistakes are just too egregious at this point, and we're going to punish you like no tomorrow. They find the right angles to shut down LNG's over-aggressive tendencies, all the while slowly scaling to their benefit. And unfortunately, just one team fight in Game 4, the series is done. And what looked like a very likely reverse sweep fizzles out of nowhere. LNG from the first two games look like a team that excite me and show a lot of potential, but given how easily it was for BLG to find their weakness and punish them for it, leaves me wondering how they'll manage to face up the bracket as the competition just gets harder and harder from here on out. Which is real unfortunate because from the way the games 3 and 4 were handling, BLG looked like the stronger team. But I've mentioned it with previous series that I've covered here, and if it takes you long to really ramp up, that's not a better sign. Now, shout out to Lamau and Light, who carried this team in terms of damage and space control. Incredibly fun to watch, and really something a lot of, if you want to learn how to create space and really use it, do watch this series. Really awesome. Also, game 2, the Herald fight, hugely recommended to watch. Just for that, at least. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the inaugural LCK playoff. Right from Korea, we've got Liiv Sandbox versus DRX. And Game 4 alone is worth watching. On the edge of your seat at any moment. God, it's so good. Now, for the first series from the LCK in the summer, and I'm slightly concerned though. This was action-packed at the tail end of each game and slow at the start of each game. Liiv Sandbox over here, for their part, had such solid coordination during their fights, some great vision application around neutrals, some questionable vision denial, but the entire time I'm left wondering what happens when they are proactive instead of reactive from the start of the game. And we got the answer in Game 3. Now, while the draft didn't help, it did show that Liiv Sandbox benefited from waiting for their fights that came to them and punishing, as their style largely benefited from a strong use of zoning and punishing any mispositioning. I'm concerned that a team that shows proactivity in a way that doesn't give any space for Liiv Sandbox to play their style of team fighting may just result in them fumbling. Now, DRX, for their part, are not out and will get the play into their regional finals themselves, right? But if this is what's to be shown from their proactive play themselves, then I have some questions about their target priority and how they play around neutrals that really confused me to no end. DRX shows some solid work with vision and wave manipulation, really putting a lot of pressure on the side lanes, but being ahead in gold and losing pressure overall in the map while having the tempo of the side lanes and losing the tempo while being proactive in the early game is not a good look. Now, granted, both of these teams being proactive is a good sign. I'd rather see this kind of proactivity than some of the passivity of the other teams in some of the emerging regions, but it's not a good look otherwise. Shout out to Prince and Def, who carried the world on their shoulders like no tomorrow. Again, watch Game 4. Holy smokes, these two really go all out. Let's take a look at the next series. We head off to China in the LPL with Edward Gaming versus Fun Plus Pheonix in a very fight-centric series. And man, do the world champions show their muscles. They really flex it. Edward Gaming showed themselves to be absolute monsters in a series that didn't look close for the most part. They handled vision excellently, wave manipulation on point, drafts are super solid, some of my favorite decisions, all in service of team fights and skirmishes. Something to notice, all right? They fumbled the most often around neutral objectives. Fumbling is a nice way to put it. A team who has such solid grasp on how to set up plays around anything but neutral objectives would be a worldwide powerhouse. But with so many teams relying on neutrals to get ahead, like, the upside is at least they'll know how to close out games better. The downside is that, oh man. But Edward Gaming are a team that they're just a team that secures neutrals when they have won a fight that conveniently lines up with neutrals. And just to elaborate, it's different from a team that specifically set up a neutral objective with the intention of being able to either push them off or kill them if they overcommit. Edward Gaming, when they set up a neutral objective, there's so many question marks on the priority and how they choose to either over-focus some fights over simply just zoning and securing the objective. Part of me worries that a team of such caliber will wind up fumbling when it counts because their priority on neutrals is so low that their opponents will just simply garner more out of it and outscale. And worse, if it's a team that can match them in team fights on top of playing neutral objectives better. I can only imagine that if at this point of this team, like EDG here, are only 5th seed, the top 4 seeds are just going to do better overall. We'll see if they get to improve, though. Shout out to Junja and Viper, who were huge powerhouses in early skirmishes and late game team fights, really playing to their limits and pushing Fun Plus Pheonix in a position they really couldn't answer. Let's take a look at the next one. We head off to the LCK in Korea for the second match of round 2. Damwon Gaming Kia versus KT Rolsters. And jeez, I would recommend this because it's rather insane, but like, where to begin? Both teams show insane application of vision and team fighting. And yet it seems like that doesn't extend to much else going on. Where Damwon have incredible early game pressure as every year before this iteration, their late game is questionable on a lot of occasions where they choose to slow the game down to scale instead of pressuring the advantages they need to balloon. KT, on the other hand, for their part, have a solid understanding of when they need to fight and no understanding of when not to fight. Their motto is if we win the fight, we get ahead regardless of the context. And like, to elaborate a little bit, knowing exactly when they need to fight is one thing, but in a situation where they're like, we shouldn't be fighting, they still decide to fight anyways, is really fucking weird. Granted, I prefer KT's approach to the game between the two of them. It leaves them very short-sighted on how to engage their opponents, and it helps that Damwon is their opponents is, my goodness, some of their macro choices leave me wondering where do they expect to go with some of these priorities. Overall, these games are fun, but out of the bottom 4 teams, I don't have a lot of faith for these two if the decision making isn't resolved, because as of now, neither of these teams look like world caliber teams. And it's incredibly telling that the series ends as one team is getting the Cloud Soul while the other one is hitting Nexus turrets. Shout out to Duckdam and Aiming, whose teams seriously drafted all of their hopes and dreams together just enough times for them to die. Let's take a look at the next series. We head off to Southeast Asia with the inaugural summer split playoff of the PCS with Beyond Gaming, Megabank Beyond Gaming versus J-Team. And just like every first round PCS playoff ever, it confuses delights and surprises. Now, J-Team looked confident in, one game during Game 3 and won it off of that confidence alone. The cohesion was necessary, especially against a team like Beyond Gaming, who are so well coordinated around neutrals and fights associated with them. J-Team will have a chance to recover in the lower bracket, but outside of their vision game, they don't look like a team to really expect anything from, at least from this series. Beyond Gaming, on the other hand, was a handful of surprises. It was just wonderful to watch. Now, while I think their early game approach is a little inconsistent, their neutral setup, vision from it, the way they approach the flanks and the team fights from it, as well as their use of the side lanes, is a lot better than many of the other teams that I've seen so far at this given point. Is incredibly solid. Now, if Beyond Gaming went the distance this playoffs, I would not be surprised. That said, their priority and targeting leave me wondering what would happen, or at least what it would look like against a team who has a similar, if not better, level of coordination. Would they be able to, pull off the kinds of plays they had in the series? Beyond Gaming could go the distance, but they have yet to convince me they are a world's caliber team. Winning decisively against the shy team is not the same as going head-to-head against a competitive team who calls out your questionable decisions. Shout out to Likai and Minji, who honestly pressured the side lanes efficiently and used the team fights in a way that left J-Team scrambling for their next move at every given turn. Take a look at the next series. Back to China with LPL's Weibo Gaming versus LNG Esports. And LNG keep up their streak. How long will they make it? That aside, I'm super surprised at how LNG keeps getting away with their plays. But they do. Weibo, on their third game, showed us that matching the aggression and making sure that LNG has no time to set up their fights means that LNG is ultimately lost on how to approach any of the other parts of the game. And while Weibo have not impressed me in the slightest, being a team with a one-track draft style and very little flexibility in terms of game plan, LNG show very poor vision control, inconsistent side lane approaches, rushed neutral objectives on so many different occasions. But these wins show one thing, at least, is that they know how to deny vision And they also know how to use that fog of war to spring traps and enable advantages in their fights. And this is especially useful during these neutral objectives because, my god, they may not set them up properly, but because they've denied a lot of vision, whenever you end up in a situation where your opponent rushes them, at least they know how to spring a trap when their opponent isn't properly setting up the neutrals. Now, I want to see them show better applications of this, especially in regards to actually placing vision. But for the moment, they are doing rather well regardless of their next match. And given that, they should now have a lot of leeway when it comes to qualifying for Worlds. LNG fans should be excited. Shout out to Ala and Light, who really popped off this series, especially within their own lane matchups against literal titans in the league. Let's take a look at the next one. Off into the PCS, and for the first time in a long time, the PCS's first round best of fives have not been disappointing. Very happy about that. The region really needed the boost for a minute. All right, we've got over here the CTBC Flying Oysters versus Frank Esports, and Frank Esports here show a lot of solid fundamentals. Proper vision play, where and when to attack neutrals, how to attack certain win condition and advance their own. The one thing holding them back this series is the lack of coordination during team fights, especially as they start to hesitate at the game going on. It was clear that any moment falling behind in gold created some unease in the play. The Flying Oysters, who were, by default, better coordinated team, looked so excellent in comparison to Frank Esports, were even slightly behind and nervous they could not approach them. But they show signs of hope for when they go into the lower bracket, so I don't expect them to necessarily just falter when they get there. Likely possibly to move forward. The Flying Oysters, on their part, concern me a little bit by the brazen approach to their neutral objectives and inconsistent use of vision or lack thereof. Like mentioned before, the team fighting is excellent and their coordination, and they have solid use of side lane pressure that is being managed excellently. They weave their drafts in a way that allow them to flexibly pull in Frank Esports and use their aggression as a point of impact. It's very rare to see a team proactively bait their opponent into fighting instead of just waiting. It's a very clever way to circumvent some of the draft weaknesses that they pulled in. Let's see how it holds up against their rivals in the Talons going into the next round. Shout out specifically to Gemini and Rest, who established a lot of the early groundworks that allowed them to win these fights later into the games. Let's take a look at the next one. We head off to China in the LPL for a match of Titans, the MSI champions versus the world champions. We've got Edward Gaming versus Royal Never Give Up. And many people expected this to go the other way. I was one of them. That said, honestly, Edward Gaming keep getting better and better every series that I've seen so far. That being just 2, but still, every game so far has been better and better. Now, while the Royals here still have the regional qualifier to look to, there is so many questions as to their approach of the game and their flexibility. The Royals hold solid vision and side lane pressure, but their teamfight coordination is a little all over the place, and their drafts frequently make their jobs much harder than necessary. Edward Gaming, for their part, are still showing some bizarre applications, notably in Game 3 with the Vladimir draft and never doing anything for it to scale properly despite it being a win condition. But they have shown that their neutral objective approach is excellent. Vision control could use some work, but the denial of vision affords a lot of room for their team fighting and coordination that seems unmatched at this point. I'm honestly blown away by how well they play with tempo and gold leads, and frequently where they put their attention of this tempo and gold lead while ahead. I think this team is looking like a solid contender for the top 10 at Worlds. And I kind of just want to see how they navigate being far behind in a game or facing a team that can actually match their team fighting head to head. But this team looks like they are going the distance and are very likely to qualify as one of the 4 of the LPL going to Worlds. Now, shout out to Flandre and Scout, who kept finding engages and re-engages that turned their fights in their favor every single time. It is mwah, chef kiss. Let's take a look at the next series. We head to the semifinals of the LCK straight in Korea. We've got GEN.G versus Liiv Sandbox. And honestly, anybody who knew how this matchup was going to go knew bloodshed was right on the table immediately. Now, I mentioned before that Liiv Sandbox knows when to fight, but not when not to fight. Fighting is such a hard motto of theirs, and GEN.G match it 100% to a T. The biggest difference is that GEN.G punish Liiv Sandbox mistakes wholesale and regularly, just like almost every single go, there's a mistake made, punished so easily. And it comes to a point where even when Sandbox are ahead, GEN.G are getting more gold to eventually win out in the late game and scale better. And a lot of this has to do with how their draft is set up. Now, there was a point where I realized that the Sandbox have an incredible grasp of how the early game plays out, but wind up lost on what to do in the late game. Just to make sure how their win conditions are met. And while Sandbox will have a chance in the regional qualifiers for one of the last 2 spots at Worlds for Korea, this is not a good look for what Worlds would look like if they qualify. GEN.G, for their part, look and feel like Sandbox, but with all of the preparations and proper side lane pressure as an added package and bonus. I'm here just wondering when the aggressive fighting that GEN.G bring will be punished, or if all the teams will have to worry about the constant pressure this team brings, as 100% the fastest team I've seen so far from what has been played. Shout out to Lehens and Ruler, who played out of their minds the whole series. Lehens especially. Like on his Yumi, God, the thing looks broken even more than usual. Let's take a look at the next one. We head off to Southeast Asia with the PCS, where we've got J Team versus Meta Falcon Team. Meta Falcon Team's name. What are you guys doing? Very clean, very one-sided. Okay, not very clean, but very one-sided affair. Like the casters put it, where was this team at Game 1, let alone the last series? J-Team are more decisive, have fun and cohesive drafts, clear game plan, and solid understanding on how to maximize your own win conditions versus minimizing your opponents. Now, Meta Falcon Team, for their part, had overall stronger vision and neutral setup, but never enough to handle some of the fights that were coming their way, or even how to use the pace to their advantage to close out games when they did have a lead of some sort. Watching the series gets me to think that J-Team, given their regular season history, is for sure 100% unable to pull these kinds of games against higher seeded teams due to either a lack of ability to do neutral setups, to have vision control that is consistent, or even consistent side lane pressure, so on, so forth. There are so many individual parts of it where the core fundamentals are there, but not consistently there. and are a lot better than some of their lower seeded counterparts, but the series showed why they're the seeded third place, but also why they aren't likely to clinch one of the two PCS slots for Worlds unless they fix the underlying issues causing them to be unable to play against the higher seeded teams. Now, shout out to KANGA and Uniboy, who really initiated these fights excellently and kept up the tempos in ways that forced Falcon team to just be unable to answer or even respond in any significant way. Let's take a look at the next series. And we head to the first series of the Turkish region, the TCL, where we've got Fenerbahçe Esports versus Dark Passage. And I'm not going to lie, this is not one of my favorite series. It really comes out of nowhere in terms of expectations. What was happening this series? I fully expected Dark Passage to win this before watching anything. They were by far the most expected, the favorite of this series. And instead of finding the team that was super solid, I instead found a team that knew how to set up vision and neutral objectives, but were hesitant around every quarter, uncoordinated during fights, and when the coordination does finally stick, it's far too late. Not to mention the very questionable drafts from both teams. Only really in Game 4 did I think that both teams were considering how to approach high success rate plays. Fenerbahçe, for their part, showed some solid coordination and knew how to navigate these neutral team fights. Just my issue here is that the lack of vision and side lane pressures and neutral setups overall make it very hard for me to see this team as a strong contender for the solo slot that TCL has. Dark Passage dropped the ball so hard that Fenerbahçe were given wins more than the wins were coordinated from their part. Fenerbahçe had proactivity and strong sense of direction, but if the direction you move in is a straight line with no resistance and no bumps, then how much coordination and strong play is really needed? Not to lie about this, but they still executed on their plans and drafts as expected solidly, but there wasn't much resistance from Dark Passage to really see how well that execution was. Shout out to Songwon and Bao, especially Bao, who genuinely navigated these fights in some crazy ways to continuously outmaneuver Dark Passage. Take a look at the next series. We head to the CBLOL in the lower bracket for Red Canids Kalunga versus Kabum Esports. And this was a really fun series. I quite enjoyed this one. They can't be perfect, but this was really enjoyable. Now, Kabum showed a lot of proactivity and solid vision control, some of the best ones within that particular league. But when it came down to the coordination around fights or consistent side lane control, they wound up falling flat many times. Red Canids, on their part, do very well around neutral contests and other coordinated fights, and decently for some vision denials to help set up those fights, but the bulk of vision control, especially for their side lane controls, is often lacking, and players are caught out so frequently because of that fact. The Red Canids show a lot of spunk and solid ideas of how to control momentum, but so many of their fundamentals of the game are just completely skipped, making it very easy to halt any of their game plans and completely overtake them in ways they can't handle. I've been a big fan of Red Canids in the CBLOL, but given the play from their opponents, I don't think it's likely that they'll clinch the spot for Worlds unless they fix their fundamentals in vision and side lane pressure. And doing so would help make their fantastic team fighting and neutral contests even more. Like, just more better, right? Which is super unfortunate because when you see them approach their fights, a lot of the times they're so fantastic while they're forced behind. So hopefully they can fix those small issues, so easy to fix, and they'll be that more likely to go through. Shout out to Greftar and Titan, who, with all of their might, fought tooth and nail to find any small advantages or angles for the fights they had. Let's take a look at the next one. Into the LLA with, in Latin America, with Team Ace versus Rainbow 7. And it really didn't matter which way this could have gone. Now, you could have coin flipped just to predict who would win, and I would be okay with either result going through. Not because both teams are exceptional, but because both teams would constantly make mistakes in ways that would decide the game for them instead of their strategy or draft choices. By all accounts, both teams show some excellent neutral setup, vision control, and denial, strong draft senses, good understanding of how to approach their win conditions. But those aspects didn't matter so much as waiting for one side to make a mistake large enough at a time of the game that mattered where it would not be able to come back into the game. One team, they would keep making mistakes back and forth, and then one team would make a mistake large enough that no matter what they would do, it essentially cost them the game. Neither team really ballooned their leads in a significant way. Neither team played side lanes or sieges well either. And I'm left baffled because so much of the fundamentals are solid from either of the teams. And that is really frustrating to see these games decided by errors more than the actual merits of the players themselves. Either team moving on would not give me faith that either would claim the spot for LLA's representatives at Worlds. Shout out to 5Kid, who was the most consistent performer out of Team Ace, and Dimitri, who always seemed to be on the lookout to make a play and keep things going. It was really good to at least see individuals having moments to shine. Let's take a look at the next series. And it's the inaugural North American LCS Summer 2022 playoff. We got Team Liquid versus FlyQuest. And they threw us off a little bit. From game one, I thought this would be a lot more competitive. Both teams showing some solid signs of neutral play, great vision application, some wonky draft choices, but overall very adaptive. But then the series moves on, and Team Liquid just gets better and better as they go. Where I once thought they had some bad habits of slowing down as the game moves on, disappears, especially by the time Game 4 hits, where some of the more shallow vision tendencies becomes a lot deeper and a lot more expansive and complete. Any particular small mistakes, they seem to just build up better and better over time. The circle around the draft choices, though, both sides opted often to play drafts that would benefit from stronger engage options, but instead opted into more complicated compositions, which inherently fine, but given the inconsistent applications of these drafts, it confused me at times. Team fighting definitely goes the way of Team Liquid, and primarily on how they used vision denial to really gain as many advantages before the fight even begins. And while FlyQuest have some solid individual players and some solid outplay moments, you can tell that there are times where the coordination isn't quite there yet. Shout out to Santorn and Core JJ, who really applied the setups early game that allowed every snowball that Team Liquid themselves could play from and really gain advantages as they picked up things to go. Also, please, for the love of God, stop picking Vayne. There's a service announcement, all right? Unless you think you are that much better than your opponent, stop. It is disrespectful. I'm looking at you, FlyQuest. Let's look at the next series. We head off to the LPL in China, where we've got LNG Esports versus V5 or Victory 5, however you want to put it. And holy smokes, this was definitely LNG series to lose. How it got to Game 5 is beyond me. But there is something infectious about the hype of seeing the 7th seed clinch top 4. And really looking like they could go the distance for first place. LNG are still showing some signs that concern me. Difficulty with proactive play while behind or delayed. Vision is not always as consistent as it should be, either in the control. With the control aspect, the denial aspect, they're still pretty excellent in. And their neutral control is a little wonky. But they keep showing they know how to control tempo of the game, their leads, how to balloon them, side lanes, and more importantly, how to control the chaos that exists in a fight. Victory 5, for their part, had incredible vision control and neutral objective control, but their inflexibility and slow tempo made it so that we saw them make comebacks more than we saw them create any wins. When your team wins in games that feel like the other team threw, then you know there's something that you need to clean up at that point. That said, Victory 5 did match LNG blow for blow in chaos and showed that LNG have a weakness, and that is overcommitting on plays that have already been won. I'm excited to see how LNG holds up against JDG, and if they will pull off the full miracle one, or they will be shot down to join V5 in the regional finals. Shout out to Ala and Lamau, who keep finding these bizarre angles that enable the chaos the rest of the team needs to thrive in these types of fights. Let's take a look at the next run. And we have the LCK in Korea. We got ourselves T1 versus Damwon Kia. A nice little rivalry that, how the hell did we get here? So first off, congratulations on T1 and GEN.G on being the second and third teams to qualify for Worlds, respectively. Now, how did we get here, really? Damwon Kia, for their part, still show, to be an excellent team regarding some vision control and early game pressure, but their hesitation and passivity in the mid to late game is really on spotlight, as T1 consistently know how, what to do and commit to it and have a game plan at all times at any given, for all 5 games. Now, Damwon Kia have interesting draft choices that I don't fully agree with, and for the first time in a long time, I think that T1 makes some excellent draft decisions, which is something not to be said lightly, especially for playoff T1s. I do think that T1, with their incredible consistent coordination and teamfight prowess, show some lacking in terms of the vision control that could be leveled up a little bit, at least to match the degree in which they have their vision denial, which really helped inform a lot of their decisions and how they approach the game excellently. Damwon Kia move down to the regional finals and have more chances to qualify for Worlds, but the series really showed to me that they can pull off proactivity if they want, but something is holding them back where their indecisiveness really hurts them overall. And it makes me hesitant to think that they may even qualify at all, given most of what I've seen, just unless they fix up their lack of proactivity. I am excited to see what the first and second seed of the LCK are going to show in the finals. It'll give us a nice little sneak peek as to what the rest of the world will have to contend with. And we'll also get to see who does get first and second seed for the World's placement in the finals. Let's take a look at the next series, though. Onward to the PCS in Southeast Asia, where we got FANGA Esports versus Impunity. This was pretty crazy. It was pretty one-sided, kind of. All kudos to Impunity, who managed to present cracks in the facade that is FANGA Esports. Where FANGA Esports looked more coordinated, had the stronger plays, the easier track towards neutrals, the stronger team fight approach, Impunity just comes around in Game 3 and shows us all that FANGA Esports actually have very limited draft options. With the limited draft options they can play around, it's just flanking options for side lanes and all eyes on M&M to carry fights. The second you limit the space for them to approach, then FANGA Esports kind of fall apart and become super uncoordinated, which was really bizarre given the way that games 1 and 2 performed. And if a team like Impunity can figure that out and adapt in that way, then by all means, every team in the upper bracket currently is just bound to see it and say, perfect, we can pull that off significantly better. That said, all right, FANGA Esports are still a team with excellent team fight coordination, and when push comes to shove, some solid macro choices. But the desperation was really there on both sides, as Impunity looked to send us to silver scrapes, but were stopped by a very poorly decided elder fight, while our friend YSKM in FANGA Esports was split pushing to win the game. Shout out to M&M and Pretender, who stayed alive for so long in these fights and maximized damage in really gnarly ways. They're really fun to watch, if anything, for this series. Take a look at the next one. We head off to the TCL with Papara SuperMassive Blaze versus Galatasaray Esports. And I'm a little frustrated with this series, I'm not gonna lie. Now, I preferred the approach that Galatasaray had to the game. Just better vision control, better design, better vision denial, stronger sense on when to take fights for neutral objectives or how to set them up at least, better side lane management, just overall a lot of the fundamentals are better approached by Galatasaray. What they didn't have was the team fight coordination and the ability to create tempo. Holding on for so long and just letting the time pass for both teams to scale is a success strategy for SuperMassive Blaze. That said, SuperMassive have some issues of their own, notably in the vision and neutral objective standpoint. Where fighting and picks come naturally to this team, just to up the tempo at least, it comes at a cost for any proper setup for any other objective. Now, SuperMassive shows some promise in those departments. So it's just that they're not consistently done. And any other team that matches their tempo and their team fight, but also sets up other objectives consistently, and we have a recipe for disaster for SuperMassive. Given what I saw, neither team inspired confidence as prospects for the TCL reps to Worlds, but SuperMassive will have a chance to prove things wrong in the next stage of playoffs. Now, shout out to Xayaz and Focus, who during these really intense team fights with some chaos, found some interesting angles to carry the fights where needed. Let's take a look at the next one. We head off into Brazil with the CBLOL Grand Final. Pain Gaming versus Loud. Well, it was a really long series. It really did not need to be that long. This was very much a Pain Gaming series to lose. Now, while Loud was much more consistent with vision control and how they approached the neutral objectives, their indecisiveness was their ultimate downfall. And not during just fights. It includes moments of which lanes to attack, what kind of wind conditions to approach, or even the setup that had so much time spent on it, if it's even worth pursuing. Pain Gaming, on the other hand, are dedicated to any decision to a fault. Once a decision is made, even if it's a terrible one, the team supports it and goes for it 100%. Now, this sometimes, all right, can lead to some very frustrating approaches where they either like keep using a neutral objective to try to make the game progress with forced fights, or just to grab it to make it easier to siege, or they overdive regularly instead of just properly sieging and letting the minions do a lot of the work. Overall, I was pleasantly surprised by the quality of 4 of the 5 games. Game 4 will be completely erased from my memory. How did it get to that point? Now, I really want to see if any of the other teams will come back from the lower bracket to challenge Pain Gaming at what they do, and to actually like capitalize and punish on the things that they're weak on, right? The inconsistent vision control when it comes to mid to late game, overcommitting on certain decisions, because otherwise they'll just reign as the CBLOL reps for World Championships. And if that's the case, well, Pain Gaming is going to get a really rude awakening come to the tournament, and other teams do match them and punish them at their weaknesses. Shout out to Weiser and Trigo, who kept things together during these fights to gain any ounce of an advantage where it left. Just any small little tiny little lead. Let's take a look at the next one. And we go back to North America's LCS with Cloud9 versus CLG, and all CLG fans can see it now. We kind of expected this to happen. We really did. There's no, like, as a CLG fan, I am not surprised at the result. Hitting the lower bracket, CLG will have to contend with their decision-making and vision issues. Just both hold hand in hand, as without full information, whatever choices you opt for will be incomplete and likely very wrong. Now, they showed signs that they can do it, and with solid coordination and excellent team fighting out of them, I can see CLG taking maybe the 4th seed, but I'm not convinced they'll do it. The same thing goes for Cloud9, actually, who are inconsistent with their decisiveness and ability to coordinate team fights, but they still keep up a lot of proactivity with their excellent vision control and denial. They can make up a lot of their weaknesses that they hold during team fights, as they regularly find picks and number advantages, especially around neutral objectives. I really enjoy I'll really enjoy seeing how Cloud9 pull off these kinds of team fighting scenarios that play against teams that play with fewer mistakes overall, as that will truly tell me if they're able to pull off getting one of the seeds for Worlds, or if they're going to require to play against a team that makes a lot of mistakes to pull off any of the plays that they have. And it's not like they can't pull off these plays regularly. It just seems like this is a thing that they lean on more than anything else. Now, shout out to Berserker and Sven, who created large advantages in their lanes on their own, and thanks to it, and thanks to a lot of the way that they positioned, helped enable a lot of the way that they played around their vision game that worked so well for that squad. Let's take a look at the next series. And we head off to the LLA just before the grand finals, the semifinals, the losers finals, however you want to put it. We've got Isirus Gaming versus Team Aze. I quite enjoyed this series, actually. Now, proactivity and coordination will give you the edge on virtually all circumstances, especially well against teams that work mostly to set up and react to plays from game to game. Aze show a lot of solid vision play and neutral setup, as well as punish some of the more outlandish plays that Isurus throw at them. But the lack of proactivity and the need for Isurus to make mistakes in order to hit their milestones makes it super clear as to why Isurus won it out at the end. More often than not, a team with sufficient coordination will also pull off the setup to make the play work, and while Isirus didn't have the vision control consistently, it was there, especially in the lead and in crucial moments. And vision denial was more than in abundance. I mentioned those first and foremost because in terms of team fighting, these teams are pretty matched blow for blow, but it's just that Isirus always got the first blow in, and because all other things came out even during the early game in terms of like setting up regular vision controls or like wave manipulation or laning in and of itself, it mostly made zero differences outside of who was the team that came out first and just made the first play. I think that Isirus' playstyle is one I prefer overall, especially for a team from the LLA who may go to Worlds depending on how the rematch goes. As passive play is regularly a recipe for disaster against stronger teams. I'm really looking forward to the rematch in the grand finals to see how it pans out between Estral and Isirus. Shout out to Grell and Seiya, who not only created the plays, but often saved them if the execution didn't quite pan out the way that it was supposed to. Let's take a look at the next series. Let's head off to the LPL, where we got, the LPL in China, where we got Top Esports versus Edward Gaming, and congrats to Top Esports on being the 4th team to qualify for Worlds. These two teams, all right, are the strongest teams in the world right now, and for very similar reasons. They've got already solid team fighting is a must, but also coupled in with some incredible vision denial, some vision control on top of it for both in teams that really that both teams really work with super well. Incredible side laning usage. Just this was such a good series, guys. Like so back and forth, but like in not a frustrating ways. Both teams find ways to be proactive while either ahead or behind, never letting up, and finding ways to force mistakes instead of waiting for mistakes to just happen from their opponent. The difference between these two teams really is just how much more flexible Top Esports is compared to EDG, and just how much better they are at playing while behind in gold. There's an awareness of the limits that Top Esports play, or at least employ, that is so nice to watch, especially in Game 5, playing around vision and making sure to use the strengths of the draft that they've have itself, right? It was just, so good. I do worry about some of the draft choices in question, though, especially as it makes their ability to play in this current meta a little harder. But as far as I can tell, this team is looking like a top 8 at Worlds for sure. Now, shout out to Wayward and Mark, who really maximized their tools to gain any little advantages during team fights and really making their carries look super good. So take a look at the next series. Let's head back to Oceania. In the LCO, we've got Chiefs versus Order. And I was starting to think 3-0s didn't exist anymore. Well, they do still. Despite this scoreline over here, Order showed a lot of potential on how to approach this matchup if they ever make it to the rematch through the lower bracket. Both teams with some very clever vision play, flank angles, and neutral setups. The difference maker between these two teams really is how quickly the Chiefs play to their win conditions, while Order just continuously play to stop the Chiefs' win conditions. Order just have a play to not lose mentality, and while watching the first two games, I could see why. The Chiefs look like a team that could rival a lot of the lower-seeded regions, a lot of the lower-seeded legacy region teams. the likes of third and fourth seeded teams of North America, Europe, Korea, or China, you could see them possibly contesting them. And mostly because out of the first two games, you wouldn't see a lot of the regular mistakes that a lot of these big league teams would commonly find on emerging region teams and punish. It was not super clear to see all of these. That said, it's a good thing that we saw Game 3 played out as it did, as the Chiefs show solid proactive play while behind significantly in a lot of moments, but also moments of overzealousness that, if behind like this against a better team overall, would have been punished a lot harder than it did in this instance against Order. Shout out to Arthur and Aladork, who were absolute monsters in this series regarding the setup for any early game plays or the late game team fights in and of itself. Let's take a look at the next series. Off to the LPL with the first of the double elimination bracket part of their playoff time. We've got over here JD Gaming versus LNG Esports. And don't worry, the miracle one for LNG is not over. They have the lower bracket. Now, this is what an early game powerhouse looks like. There is something impressive about the way that JDG use their early game drafts and tools to create leads that are really hard to engage on during the mid to late game. Really holding in a lot of the early game vision, early game camps themselves, really holding down Tarzan the entire time in a way that is just not possible for LNG to keep up. Which is why it is equally impressive to see LNG hold JDG off during these stages despite the early leads accrued. Both teams navigating vision denial and control to garner any kind of advantages during different stages of the game. It's clear that if LNG were able to hold off just a little better during these early game stages, that JDG would not have been able to navigate their approach, as their drafts really rely on picks that have very little engage tools and don't scale well as they go into as they go into the late game. That most other teams would usually pick drafts that scale well into the late game. And I think that because of it, LNG really should be stated as really navigating the late game fairly well in this case. Now, I think that JD Gaming going into the matchup against Top Esports will have to prove they can adjust their approach to the game when it gets to at least the mid to late game stages, or even prioritize neutral objectives just that much more, especially while having large leads like the ones they've garnered in those games. Shout out to Yagao and 369, who helped close the gap in late game team fights and often swung JD Gaming to victory to close out said games. Let's take a look at the next series. We head off to Oceania with the LCOs, Pentanet GG versus KANGA Esports. Oh man, this is such a frustrating series to watch. Don't let the scoreline deceive you, alright? This was a closer matchup than you'd expect. But like I've mentioned before in previous reviews, the edge for a team usually goes to the team who is more proactive, and oh boy, is Pentanet proactive to a fault. KANGA did an incredible job, did super incredibly well to punish the overzealous approaches and far-reaching members of Pentanet, especially Yuri and Balkan, who were the cause of many headaches for the team. Now, while it's good that they punish them for those mistakes, Pentanet GG, on their hand, would do the same back, as a lot of the same kinds of mistakes, a lot of the overzealousness, far-reaching attempts at getting turrets, being way too far out into lanes, or being mispositioned, those would get equally punished by Pentanet, who at the end of the day would just get larger leads from it. With each little advantages is something even larger to gain overall. Pentanet do play around a lot of these particular mistakes as well as their proactive plays super well, especially when it comes around to neutral objectives, as they have like excellent vision denial to back it up. The vision control is a little inconsistent, but super good. I think the issue comes around is that the disconnect the teams show sometimes and the constant mistakes makes it hard for me to believe that they would win against Order in the rematch, let alone face the Chiefs in a meaningful way. Shout out to Yuri and Balkan, still, who even with their mistakes are keeping the game proactive and the tempo up, which is super necessary to the type of style that they play. Let's take a look at the next one. It's the first playoff series in Japan with the LJLs, Fukuoka SoftBank Hawks Gaming, oh god, that name, versus Burning Core, much better name. Honestly, this is an incredibly confusing series. It's worth skipping, but unless you want to see something very bizarre in terms of draft, because I've never had a team confuse me more than Burning Core. From the bizarre draft choices that are executed near perfectly in the early game, but get lost in the mid game, to the excellent vision denial followed by mediocre vision control, to solid approaches towards the neutral objectives but near zero priority on them when it is required. It's just, Burning Core is a team that clearly knows what to do, but only kind of does it half-assed. The Hawks, for their part, are consistent in this series, having drafted very safe, waited until Burning Core could no longer play the game they wanted, and then proceeded to have a very proactive move around the map that matched their draft priorities. And for that, honestly, really solid from the Hawks. But it's hard to evaluate them in this situation because of how well Burning Core was doing in the early games. Like, honestly, it's really confusing. So, like, are the Hawks good? Or is Burning Core bad? Just in a confusing way. Honestly, either way, nothing convinced me in this series that either team would have made it to the finals regardless of the result. And we'll just have to, let alone just making it to Worlds, and we'll just have to see how the Hawks do against a team that's less confusing than Burning Core. Because there are stuff here that the Hawks do that is really excellent. I'm just unsure if it's excellent because of the team they faced off or because they're consistent. We'll get to see. Shout out to Blank and Raina, who found some really nice angles for team fights. It was really satisfying to see them approach some of these engages. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the first series for the summer split of the VCS in Vietnam. We've got the Saigon Buffaloes versus Team Secret. And this was really one-sided until not so much. It just wasn't even close on so many levels. Like, just like all one-sided series, it's a little harder to evaluate things as is. Given the situation on how Game 3 played out, a lot of the earlier mistakes show up on a lot more obvious situations. The Buffaloes have incredible persistence to make any play work, fantastic vision denial and neutral approach, incredibly proactive. But then in Game 3, Team Secret show the weakness at hand, which is the map movement is incredibly delayed and uncoordinated across the team. And the ability to siege and play side lanes is not much better. Granted, Team Secret also had these issues, and if they want to manage climbing up the lower bracket for a spot at Worlds, they'll need to make some course corrections. because both of these teams showed fantastic approaches to the fundamentals, but it's not as encouraging when it comes to some of their positional errors, map movements, and just the way that they manipulate side lanes, as that's something that'll be punished on the international stage even harder, let alone what is likely going to be the Marines really in full force. Shout out to Bean, Jay, and Taki, who during a lot of these different fights that they've created and saved also ended up really creating a lot of space that split up Team Secret in very novel and interesting ways. Let's take a look at the next series. Into the LPL with the third game of round 4. We've got Edward Gaming versus LNG Esports. And, oh boy, this was a really solid series. And the current world champions show full force, but not without any contest. LNG really show us the power of proper early game play that translate into later stages. The issue is that Edward Gaming have properly absorbed those attempts regularly, and whenever LNG fall behind, their decisions start to make less and less sense overall. LNG being a team that functions late game only when ahead is a little rough given how well they approach all other aspects of the game. Incredible vision play, solid flank angles, and approach team fights, all things that both of these teams do, but due to how LNG draft and their style of play, if the early game goes belly up, or their opponents come back in any way, their plan tends to fall apart. LNG still has the regionals to make worlds, but that's 2 more best of 5s to try to really shore up the need to have a really solid early game play and then have that snowball later, because who knows, they have to face off in the rematch against Victory 5, and they might have adapted to face their opponents in the same way again. Now, EDG, for their part, are looking better than ever, right? Especially with their late game approach. And much of their early game also stays fairly on par. They show that right now, they might just be the second best team of the LPL, maybe the best, depending on if they make the run for a rematch against Top Esports and then win that series. I think that given how Edward Gaming play at such a fast pace, it's undeniable that teams around the world should be worried. Now, shout out to JJ and Mako, who are kingmakers in these team fights, making things so easy for all of their carries to just navigate where they need to go. Let's head off to the next series. On to the PCS, where we're in the upper bracket. We've got Megabank Beyond Gaming versus Deep Cross Gaming. And the score says one thing, the results are a totally different thing. And by that I mean mostly that neither of these teams to me, like, now Beyond Gaming are looking like the strongest team fighting team and neutral team of the PCS. And just mostly that they need work on everything else. Deep Cross Gaming had the stronger vision approach, better neutral setup, better side lane management, better draft adaptation, stronger laners, better early game overall. And if you're starting to sound like this is a lot of things all of a sudden, how does Beyond Gaming get 3-0 then? Well, the second we hit the team fight, all bets are off. Beyond Gaming will be 5k down and win as if they're 6k up. And part of that in this series is due to the lack of coordination and questionable target selection out of Deep Cross Gaming. And to top it off, the positioning from the likes of Hana or Cruscata downright throws many of these fights. Beyond Gaming do make the best out of every resource on hand, though, making sure to have some excellent positioning and flank angles. My concern is that if they face a team who are just as good, if not better, in terms of team fighting, how do they fare given how poor their laning phase went? These two teams are in the top 4 of the upper bracket, but I have no faith at this moment that either team would make solid representatives for the PCS. And that's rather concerning. Now, a shout out to Wako and Minji, who should honestly be studied if anybody wants to figure out how to approach positioning in a team fight. Like, holy smokes, they're really good. Off to North America with the LCS's lower bracket playoff. Team Solo Mid versus FlyQuest, and what a very evenly matched series. These two teams have shown a lot of solid vision play, very awkward neutral approaches, a wide spectrum of teamfight approaches ranging from very awkward to excellent, and some individual outplays that are incredibly executed. These teams were evenly matched on all fronts. The only thing here is that TSM was a lot more consistent in all of these approaches of the game. Now, this begs the question, if their ability to face higher seeded teams will match this at all, or if it's even good enough. Just looking back on how Team Liquid fared against FlyQuest, I can see an avenue in which TSM could catch them off guard, but the level in which they would have to play there consistently is just not here in this series. Especially not with some of the more awkward flank approaches and brazen macro choices around neutrals that FlyQuest were able to just answer so easily. But a lot of this still applies to FlyQuest in about the same way. Either of these teams going, it still would have been difficult to say which one would be doing fine more than the other. That said, Team Solomid did find an avenue of flexibility with their drafts, allowing for more variety of options that just didn't exist with FlyQuest. Let's just see if they can bring that to the next stage, whoever their opponent might be from that. Shout out to Maple and Solo, who created the spaces that allowed some of the more awkward approaches that TSM attempted to thrive and work so well. Let's take a look at the next series. We go to the winners finals in the LPL right off in China with JD Gaming versus Top Esports in our first reverse sweep, and not in the way you would think. Now, congratulations on JD Gaming for securing the 5th spot at Worlds Asterisks, and mostly asterisks for Top Esports. There are some weird situations given that there's still 3 teams in the regular playoffs with Edward Gaming who could win it all, which means that one of these two lose their automatic breath into Worlds. Specifically, Top Esports would lose it. But we'll see how things. Now, this series was incredibly close and embodied the idea of the LPL to a T. Not a single resource out of place, everything contested, but not in the way that seems frivolous. More like how dominoes are lined up to be knocked down perfectly. Every summoner, ultimate, buff, turret, dive, all of it to serve as a grander setup to the larger team fights. Now, the vision control and denial from both sides were back and forth. Either side with a lead would force mistakes excellently, and when things got super late, only the team who executed the winning fight better, just marginally, came out on top. Now, this was a series of inches that was also our first reverse sweep of the summer playoffs across all of the regions, which is wild, like a third or quarter of the way through. Now, these teams, I find, are very evenly matched with only slight stylistic differences between the two, making it clear that either way you spin it, the LPL are sending some solid teams. If anything, I think both teams approach the game with very narrow approach if the game reaches post 40 minutes, but at that point, things are tense and anything given is already too much. Both teams deserve the first and second seed, and depending on how Top Esports play in the rematch against Edward Gaming, and depending if Edward Gaming win that one and succumb to JD Gaming, we'll see these two being the first two seeds. Now, shout out to both Hope and Jackie Love, who are respective bot laners, had the worlds on their shoulder during these fights. So much pressure to maximize damage and stay alive as long as possible. Take a look at the next series. We're off to Japan with the LJL's Rascal Jesters and Crest Gaming Act. And this is a really interesting series. I quite enjoyed this. Now, while Crest Gaming Act are the more proactive and team fight savvy team, the continuous aggression and very poor draft decisions means that they played a more difficult game than necessary. Rascal Jesters used this to their advantage, drafting simple, scaling compositions that directly address the win conditions that Crest Gaming would show. This series was one that was more stylistic in nature, first and foremost. Both teams having excellent vision game, but their neutral setups are lacking, neither side with stronger laners overall. And while Crest Gaming have their star players that really pop off, Rascal Jesters were more cohesive and in sync overall. I prefer the proactive style of Crest Gaming as opposed to the laid-back, let-it-scale playstyle from Rascal Jesters, but the Jesters did make sure that everything is set up for various plays and forced mistakes out of Crest Gaming Act instead of just waiting for mistakes to just happen, which is really nice to see from a team that would otherwise presume to just wait for a mistake to happen. Once the lead was taken, it was just a slow choke to the finish. And while I don't necessarily think the slow nature of their gameplay will benefit them in a world stage, let alone further into the playoffs, this was solid and well executed. Now, shout out to Ino, who really endured a lot of bullying from Crest Gaming Act, and Hachimicha, who undertook the heavy utility of trying to rein in Cassine down. It really helped with their late game. Let's take a look at the next one. We head off to the round 2 PCS in Southeast Asia, where we got CTBC Flying Oysters versus Paris Saint-Germain Talons. And history just repeats itself, it seems. It's just back to spring. Now, if you looked at the last game, you would have thought that this was a 3-0 stomp. In fact, this isn't the first time that the Flying Oysters hand the Talons their keisters in the round 2 of a playoff this year. To note, both sides play vision and neutral objectives rather excellently and have top laners who live by side lane control. So much of these two teams have are pretty equally matched regarding that sense. The Talons holding a lot more consistency in their play, but it is so slow, leaving a lot of open chances for the Flying Oysters to come back into the game. Like the casters mentioned, they aim for 90-10 plays, which means that they are by default less proactive. Now, that isn't to say that they don't make moves that enable their victories when necessary. It's more to say that the Flying Oysters are more likely to throw caution to the wind and make plays that are more 50-50 and come out on top because they pull the trigger more often. Now, both sides have solo laners who make some questionable positional decisions, so neither team really have the edge on that front when it came to team fighting. So looking at the coordination, it was easier to see the highs and lows of the Flying Oysters over the Talons because of how safe they played. The Flying Oysters played to win, while the Talons just played to not lose. Now, against a weaker seeded team, that may work, but in this particular case, the proactive team always gets the edge in this situation. Not the guarantee, but the edge. Now, shout out to Gemini and Koala, who do so much work to set up the rest of the team for success. Let's take a look at the next series. Off to Vietnam, where we've got GAM Esports versus SBTC Esports. I'm going to just call them the Roosters for obvious reasons. Now, I thought that GAM would come in and win the series a clean 3-0. They've had such an excellent year. Then, I thought that the Roosters would have a competitive series and take us to 5 games. Then just some confusion overall. The Roosters show some really interesting approaches to the game. Notably, its very lane-focused approach and the neutral second. The Roosters look for proactive plays that specifically involved accumulation of gold, which means a lot of skirmishes while ahead and mostly turret farming while behind. Now, GAM played similarly, but with stronger emphasis on neutrals that were available. While not incredibly one-sided, it looked like the fights that were happening around these objectives were regularly in GAM's favor, regardless of the gold difference. And I think the bigger takeaway mostly from that is that it's just the ways in which the Roosters struggled to close out games compared to their opponents. Hopefully, as they enter the lower bracket, they can shore up some of those weaknesses, because honestly, game 3 from them looked really good until it didn't, especially with the random flank engage is what really did that in. That said, GAM for their part are definitely still the stronger team. Most of the executions in terms of visions, engage, neutral setups, so on and so forth, but the way they draft make it so it's much harder for them to approach their win conditions or even their regular playstyle. So we'll have to see if they can adjust that when they head up to the upper bracket. Now, shout out to Levy and Style, who really pushed the limits of GAM's team fighting to a totally different level. Take a look at the next series. It's the inaugural playoff of Summer 2022 in Europe's LEC. We've got Rogue versus Mad Lions. Incredibly close, excellent series. Now, congrats to Rogue on being the 6th team asterisk to qualify for Worlds. This series was incredibly close. And if Mad qualifies from the results of the next LEC series, I wouldn't complain much. Especially given their performance in this series. Both teams have excellent early games with wildly different approaches for them. It was really nice and unique. Solid vision denial and excellent vision control. While neither team screams as particularly super strong in the neutral setup, they are rather serviceable and seem consistent with it. Now, I worry from the side of Mad that any play is overcommitted regularly, leading to situations that can guarantee a back is just immediately lost because they want to guarantee a kill. While Rogue seem to be less and less proactive as the game goes on, really pushing it in the early game and slowing it way down mid to late game. And largely relies on the advantages garnered across the stages to be able to push through the late game just at all. Now, both of these on the international stage will get challenged with relentless fights that will just punish some of these aspects of the play. But aside from that, it's usually just a very narrow window of play that isn't usually seen until much of the late game. And both of these teams usually are very good on staying within their pacing. Also, Rogue, disrespectful drafts like that will cost you way more going into the international stage. Just saying. Now, shout out to Larson and Comp, who maximized damage during a lot of these fights while playing with a lot of safety. It was really satisfying to see how safe they were able to play and still maximize the effort, their impact. Let's head off to the next series. And we're off into the lower bracket kerfuffle that this series was from the North American LCS. We got Counterlogic Gaming versus Golden Guardians. And honestly, not expected. Scoreline, mostly not expected. Final result, expected. Because the Golden Guardians pulled off a lot more than expected. Some very good vision play, decent neutral setup, decent coordination during team fights, superb draft sense and how to approach the win conditions from them. But the lack of proactivity during mid to late game really hurt them in the long run, and the very limited styles of draft that they could employ. Their successes mainly came from 6A outperforming during this entire series, and from the way that CLG were opting into some rather poor decision making. Which comes to the big elephant in the room. This should have been a clean 3-0 for Counterlogic Gaming. And yet here we hit silver scrapes and we see the final draft and it's not clear who would come out on top. In fact, looking at the draft, you'd think it was an easy win for Golden Guardians. Easy front to back setup that scales super well and gives a lot of space for 6A to do his magic. On the other side, no engage options, 1-3-1 setup that really requires early leads. But this time we get to see what was expected out of Counterlogic Gaming. High tempo pacing, clever approach to team fighting, solid vision play and side lane options. The goal is ballooning crazily. But the series as a whole shows even more holes in this team regarding their macro choices and target selection. When it's good, it's really good. And yet, this is super inconsistent out of them from this series and the Cloud9 series. And if they don't shape up, I have zero reasons to believe that they'll even qualify for Worlds. Shout out to Dokla and Palafox, who, honestly, when on form, really created the kind of chaos that CLG thrives under and got the leads that they needed. Take a look at the next series. Off to Southeast Asia with the PCS, where we've got Deep Cross Gaming versus Frank Esports. This was utterly one-sided. Now, sometimes it's really easy to punch down on someone who barely responds back. Frank Esports came in today with mostly defensive vision and a dream for the perfect early game scenario that they put zero effort into receiving. Deep Cross Gaming were the more proactive of the two teams, drafted for team fights and executed them better, stronger neutral controls, better flanks, just overall the better team on all categories you can think of. So seeing this, and noticing that they still fumbled on aspects of early game contests, or that their vision was rather sparse and mostly focused on vision denial around neutrals, moments of indecision that gave Frank some opportunities to come back, and overall bizarre macro choices that are rather easy to hide when you're regularly 8 to 10k ahead, if not more, in all three of the games. This was a pretty convincing series from a team that performed against the 6th seed asleep at the wheel. All right, Frank is the 5th seed at the wheel. Just this should have been, of course, an easy go, but it's even easier if Frank Esports don't even show up. And given the kind of caliber the other teams, especially the teams in the upper bracket right now, are showing, it isn't enough to convince me that they could make a run in the lower bracket and hit a world slot. Shout out to Hana and Nesty, who initiated and controlled every team fight excellently, especially Nesty. You are breaking ankles. Let's take a look at the next series. All right, we head to the first semifinals of the Turkish TCL, where we've got Fenerbahçe Esports versus Nasar Esports. And If anyone followed even the slightest bit of the TCL, you know this is like a huge upset. Not only did Nassar get the chance to choose their opponent, they chose the 6th-seeded team that just had an upset against the 3rd-seeded team. Things that both teams bring to the table, all right? Some interesting and unique team fights and flank angles, consistent vision and neutral play, and the willingness to handshake the first 20 minutes of the game until one team outscales. Now, this isn't fair to the last 2 games of the series that just don't play out that way. Each team getting the chance to show what a more proactive early game looks like for themselves. But I almost feel if the series itself probably wouldn't have turned out this way if both teams had been more proactive since game 1. I'm pretty sure I think Fenerbahçe would have gotten 3-0. I'm not even exaggerating by a lot. Overall, with a better coordination, stronger drafting sense, better execution and awareness of their own win conditions, with just slightly better vision play. My only issue is that those things are just stronger and not the best. The vision play and win conditions are only meant to secure neutral objectives and add enough pressure onto the game, as opposed to really moving those win conditions in a way that keep the tempo going, which is a shame, especially if you're drafting a lot of 1-3-1s and 1-4 style drafts. Overall, I don't think Fenerbahçe is a world's caliber team, but they are showing a much better performance than expected and have time to improve further than where they are at now. Shout out to Sangwon and Carey, who really established so much space and time to guarantee the win conditions are met at all stages. Let's take a look at the next series. We head off for the second series of the upper bracket in the LEC from Europe with G2 Esports versus Misfits Gaming. And you know what? Congrats on G2 for being the first team to qualify for Worlds, and by extent, Mad Lions is the 7th team because of the results of this series. Or I previously didn't like the idea of them qualifying without playing a single game. Now that I've seen them play games, this is fine, as the G2 we see now are early game giants. There is a satisfying set of chaotic plays out of them that leaves you entranced and hard to follow, as they pull and prod all over the mat, really stretching their opponent out. That said, the chaos does have a method, with some strong vision play and teamfight coordination. I didn't see the same kind of worries that I would usually look out for, as I had seen with the G2 of old, where if Caps wasn't on point all the time, the team tended to just kind of falter. For now. Now, their ability to take a lead and snowball it is excellent, and honestly, if this is to be expected as they head into Worlds, there should be no issues. There may be some concerns regarding their late game application against teams in the international stage, but as far as it's concerned, they're snowballing excellently to a point where there's no need to think about this now, not until we see how it looks like against other teams. Misfits, on their part, had excellent drafts, much more consistent and better than those of G2. Game 3 was a little bizarre. Solid vision play and an understanding of where their win conditions lie. The coordination isn't always there, and the rookie roster seems to have some confidence to build up, as dedicating to a play is kind of hit or miss during the series. I could see Misfits securing the last slot at Worlds, but as of now, they are strong contenders that are rather inconsistent. Shout out to Yankos and Caps, who honestly played out of their minds at all stages to balloon any leads they had. Holy crap, were they good this series. Let's take a look at the next one. And we head to Brazil's CBLOL with Furia versus Red Canids Kalunga. And this was fairly close. Blue side is king, it seems. No one's surprised. And these teams are evenly matched. If you flipped a coin and had either move on, I would be okay with it. Both teams showed incredible vision play, team fight awareness, and fantastic proactive early games. Their early games were great. Things start to break down, though, when you notice that the red Canids are more active mid to late game, but also sloppier in their neutral control, while Furia are better in their neutral control and tend to be just slow the game down, just to scale a little bit. I would have liked the best of both worlds from one of these teams, but we're not there, it seems. They are both also very one-track mind when it comes to the team fighting, often leaning on one strategy, and whoever found the golden ticket strategy came out on top. This was especially frustrating in Game 5, where the red Canids were 100% in control of the game. It was literally theirs to lose, but chose every time to fight in choke points, allowing Envy to free hit while not being targeted at all. This happened 3 times for the point where Furia was able to come back. Given this, I wouldn't have been confident that either team would beat Pain for the slot at Worlds for the CBLOL, without at least some heavy correction of how they approach their mid to late game. Shout out to Goot and Aegis, the junglers of the respective teams. They created so much of how the early game played out. This was a beautiful chess match of junglers during the series. Just nice. It's just so nice. Worth watching for that alone. Take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of the LLA. Latin America's representatives are chosen here, and we've got Isirus Gaming versus Estral Esports. And congratulations to Isurus on being the 8th team, asterisk, to qualify for Worlds. And honestly, what a solid series that leaves me excited and slightly worried. On the one hand, Estral was the better team in regards to neutral setups, vision control, pacing, while Isurus was a better team fighting team, had better vision denial, and ballooned leads much better when they got even the slightest bit of a lead that they could. While the series went back and forth, and even most of the games went back and forth internally, neither team was particularly good at closing out their games. Nor were they good at really applying even side lane controls, things that would apply their late game win conditions. Both teams had some solid early and mid games, and once that was done, it looked like the game plan was just to find a better team fighting angle. And given the result, Isurus found them more often than not. Now, while I prefer the overall approach that Estral has regarding just the general sense of making sure your win conditions are met, Isurus still bring to the table a level of excitement that I got from them in the spring split when I was doing for the MSI, like the Road to MSI series. And they have such a solid energy to them when it comes to ballooning leads and playing on the fringes of these team fights. It is very fun to watch them go. And they do still have a good amount of attempts at ballooning leads while behind, or doing some proactive stuff. But for the most part, this team is centered around team fighting, and very fun team fighting at that. It may not be good enough to dent some of the world contenders that have already qualified or seem to be on the way to qualify, but this is a solid team to send out for LLA. Shout out to Gavoto and Jelly, who really exemplified the strong team fighting that Isirus is all about. Let's take a look at the next series. We head off to the LCS's first Winners semifinal in the upper bracket. We've got 100 Thieves versus Team Liquid. These series just are hidden one after the other. Really solid stuff. Congrats to the Thieves on being the 9th team, asterisk, to qualify for Worlds. The series looked like it was going to be a sweep in either direction, regular or reverse, and it didn't end up being that. For Team Liquid, who are still in the running, their vision play, side lane management, and overall coordination is excellent. This is equally bolstered by the drafting style they had, which allows them to thrive under very different kinds of win conditions. The Thieves, for their part, didn't show the largest variety of draft styles, but did show a stronger sense of neutral play in team fights, especially the team fight angles. So much so that the games were regularly decided by how they approached those neutral team fights. It is weird to see the team controlling the tempo just not be proactive, and that's what ultimately seemed to be lacking from Team Liquid overall. Moments for sure, mostly during the early game where they'd be proactive, but once the mid to late game came around, it was mostly a waiting game then on, where 100 Thieves would either play into the trap that they would set up or fumble to make their move. The Thieves just look like a team that will, definitely test the merits of the lower seeded teams at Worlds. But because, like I mentioned, their drafting style having been the most, having not the most variety to it, I can see where some of the limitations could come in. And for the most part, from this series, I can see Team Liquid qualifying if they kind of course correct their proactivity. Shout out to Sunday and Closer, who controlled the battlefield of every single team fight in a way that were very hard for Team Liquid to manage. Let's take a look at the next series. Off to the LPL losers final / overall semifinals. In China, we've got Top Esports versus Edward Gaming, and this was fun. But first off, Top Esports secured the previous 4th qualification, as they are now guaranteed the top 2 LPL seeds at World. From that, what happens when you are the team with the stronger vision play, neutral setup, drafting instincts, side lane manipulations, and you just don't play proactive? What's worse is that you play better when you're trying to play not to lose than when you're trying to be proactive, and then you overcommit on plays that leave you vulnerable. Edward Gaming, what is up? Huh? Those are my questions for you. This was such an impressive set of games to see so well executed early game and absolutely fumbled in the late game. Now, Top Esports, for their part, are still showing us why they are the kings of late game, as so many of their win conditions are met during the late games of the stages, even though they shouldn't be. My concern is just the poor vision control when behind, very rushed neutral setups, and very weak early game overall. Teams on the international stage who play early and late game better or equally consistent are just not going to give you the chance to catch up for either of these teams if even Edward Gaming qualifies. Now, Edward Gaming do get a chance to qualify for Worlds in the rematch up against the Royals in the regional qualifiers, and hopefully they course correct to qualify because this team has a lot going for it. Just they don't follow through. Top Esports also have quite a lot going, especially in how creative their approach is while ahead or behind, really squeezing every ounce of their tools at hand. It just needs to be supplemented more with this consistent early games. But as rematches go, this one was a little disappointing. Shout out to Knight and Jackie Love, who really pushed their abilities to the limit and gained ground in those game-winning fights. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of the LCK. We've got GEN.G versus T1. Honestly, this is probably the longest and most recognizable rivalry in League of Legends, period. I can't. And for it to come ahead over here in such a one-sided stomp. What an absolute masterclass from GEN.G, who outplayed T1 and confirmed being the first seed for the LCK. The previous series was, matching chaos with just better chaos against Liiv Sandbox. This series is about matching control with even better control. Both teams have excellent vision play, map movement, side lane control, draft sense, and so on and so on. But GEN.G show up just a little better. Not just in laning matchups, but in team fightings, execution of win conditions, zone play, so on, all of the big buzzwords. Any little thing that T1 can do, GEN.G can do better. And not from a lack of trying by T1. While T1 may have been a little bit more proactive, GEN.G spent a lot of time finding ways to force mistakes out of T1 or create winning trades around the map when they are forced to answer T1's plays. T1 never got a chance to play their crazy tactical approaches consistently because GEN.G met them at their best. I think from this, GEN.G is for sure one of the contenders for the world titles, especially in this form. And while maybe not the favorite, I want to see what the other teams look like at their finals and qualifications, but they look to be semi-finalists for sure. I honestly want to shout out the whole team from GEN.G for being so incredibly good, but my behavior has been mostly to shout out just two members. So I'll give it to Peanut and Lehens, who honestly were just instrumental in keeping T1 at bay and zoned out. So excited to see both these teams at Worlds. God, it's going to be so good. Let's take a look at the next one. Off to Japan for the technically winners finals. Any of these winners would have gone straight to the finals. We've got, in the LGLs, Detonation Focus Me versus Sengoku Gaming. And it's left me with not so great ambitions for the region. While I don't think the vision or neutral play is good from either team, Detonation Focus Me gained the benefit of being a more proactive team of the two, which lands better in this particular meta. Sengoku Gaming, in their leads, would just slowly siege place sparse vision and reset, while Detonation Focus Me would regularly try to find avenues back into the game, or at least how to close it out. Sengoku Gaming is another one of those teams that on paper play better, but in practice wind up just waiting for opponents to make mistakes instead of forcing them or creating plays. This is a little unfortunate given how solid their drafts are in general. Their vision play is stronger generally, and they do have great wave management and coordination. But the team is slower, so it doesn't matter that the vision control of Detonation Focus Me doesn't match their vision denial, which their vision denial is excellent. I just don't know why they don't add vision to it. Or that they coin flip or use neutrals as a fight starter very rushed. Or that their target selection isn't even all that great or consistent. They're usually first to the play, and given what I've seen out of the rest of the LJL, this doesn't look great for them, as most of the other teams don't tend to be as proactive as what Detonation Focus Me is showing. And it's likely that we're going to see them represent Japan again this year, as far as we can tell. We'll see how the other games go, right? So, shout out to Steel and Yaharong, who played out of their minds to work within the fringes of any team fight, especially in Game 3. Holy smoke, Yaharong. Your Zoe? No one should let him get a Zoe again. Take a look at the next series. And we're off to Southeast Asia's PCS. In the lower bracket quarterfinals, we got Paris Saint-Germain Talons versus J-Team, and dear Lord, these two teams usually deliver something, and today they delivered, like, honestly, I wouldn't expect either of these teams to make it to Worlds. To me, they're just out of the running completely, right? Because if this is what you get, it's rather unfortunate, because we get glimpses from both teams of what it looks like when they're proactive and take risks. The Talons don't know their limits, and J-Team are solid, but don't know how to establish pressure outside of when they made the proactive move. Outside of that, the Talons show a stronger aptitude around neutral objectives and side lane control, but neither team show good vision play compared to the standards of the international teams who have qualified, or even of the teams in their own region. There's an unfortunate nature to watching two teams figure out what angles of approach for their fights and then never actually executing on it. The Talons, when not being proactive, at least make the time to set up the play and establish control around the map and apply pressure. J-Team, not being proactive, just watches the map burns around them. And that's what made the difference in this game. Didn't matter that J-Team finally woke up at the tail end of Game 3. The damage had been done around the map, and for the Talons' win conditions, just it making the whole thing, no matter how large or any advantage that you would get, an uphill battle, as the Talons only needed one fight to secure the whole thing. Shout out to Burry and Gory, who during the early games established so much of the setup that got the Talons ahead. Let's take a look at the next series. And we're into the VCS with the lower bracket elimination for round 1. We've got, and this is from Vietnam, VCS. We've got over here Team Secret versus SBTC Esports. I'll be calling them the Roosters. This was an interesting series. Now, I think that the Roosters struggled to come up with a variety of plays that help them, how to approach most of their fundamentals. They hold like some solid neutral setup, some excellent vision play, and instead of working around all of that, they either handshake trades around the map where they could win those trades instead of just handshaking them, or create a repetitive play over and over again that worked at the start of the game for sure and worked for a little bit, but as it keeps getting executed, is done worse and worse over time. As Team Secret just really gets to, get used to their approach to it. I wish they were doing something else most of the time. The Roosters show that when ahead they can keep control, but that their proactivity is severely limited, and they rely on Secret to make mistakes for the most part. Secret, for their part, are rather sloppy in terms of their early game and in terms of their vision. But, they have solid coordination and team fight presence and a good sense on how to approach neutral objectives and stronger draft sense overall. Good idea of how to approach their win conditions and all of that. The only thing is that they regularly throw themselves at the bus, so to speak, where any play at any given time or aggressive posturing leads them to either throw their lead or relinquish control of the map. And most of the time, they end up course correcting during the games itself, but it's enough to notice a trend that stronger teams will abuse to force errors out of Secret, who seem more than willing to throw themselves for the pace of the game, which is awesome, but positioning matters in this situation. Shout out to Hero02 and Eddie, who absorbed a lot of pressure and managed to get a lot done during the team fights. Take a look at the next series. Off to the TCL for the final semifinals of Turkey's region. We've got the Istanbul Wildcats versus SuperMassive Blaze. And oh boy, this was so one-sided. And like in a very bizarre way. Anywho, like, okay. SuperMassive couldn't compete with the level of coordination and side lane control that the Wildcats brought. Just, like, the Wildcats knew their limits, how to approach their win conditions, how to establish the vision that they needed for any given play. The largest issue is just how ambitious they are at trying to pull off some of these plays, as they kind of fumble and stumble over their steps occasionally. Now, SuperMassive, for their part, still remained as proactive as possible, but keeping up with the pace that the Wildcats had going was very challenging for them. Even in moments where it seemed like SuperMassive had full tempo control, the Wildcats were still making plays around the map to split them up or to answer equal or ahead. Now, there's a clear conscious approach to how the Wildcats want to win the game, and that's through proper dominance of the early game and carrying the momentum from there. Seems simple. That said, I do want to see how the Wildcats would fare against a team who is more consistent at closing out games. SuperMassive did their best, but would wound up resetting way more often than necessary, especially in Game 2, where their game state could have warranted pressing the issue a little bit more. Given what I've seen so far, it wouldn't surprise me if the Wildcats did win the world slots in the finals in a similar fashion as they did this series. But who knows? Fenerbahçe has been surprising many. Shout out to Saigon and Starscreen, who controlled the team fights in ways that really allowed Holy Phoenix to free fire so much damage. Holy moly. Let's take a look at the next series. It's time for the lower bracket playoff. From Europe's LEC, we've got Fnatic, the Giants, and XL newcomers. And this is our second reverse sweep. And the LEC often produces some of my favorite series during playoffs. And this is for sure one of them. It's such a shame that the format is what it is. Because, like, I would have preferred to have both of these teams move on to Worlds, given the kind of play that we saw from them. For XL, the early game coordination, pressure, tempo, and vision was unparalleled. Now, that isn't to say that Fnatic were slouches, by no means. This just was a solid set of games from both sides. But as the series goes on, Fnatic managed the second reverse sweep of the summer and showed that XL only really excelled in the early to mid game and struggled to show consistent success in the late game, whether it was from map movement, neutral setup, or team fighting. Which, by the way, so good from both sides. There's a lot of really interesting angles that go off in the first four games. And it's really a large shame that, like, the time that went into the series, the fifth game, both teams looked spent and were inconsistent. Anyways, Fnatic, for their part, require a lot of momentum in-game and series to get going, which concerns me. Like, I'm really concerned by their approach of the early game and how much they were willing to just forego a lot of, like, neutral objectives to avoid fights that could get worse for them. That said, their vision play and late game decision coordination was excellent, and I think a large contributor to the reverse sweep itself, outside of, like, the fatigue. The duos from both teams deserve a shout out, but in all honesty, just because of the format, shout out to Upset and Razark, who really maximize the efficacy of the drafts in every way imaginable. Take a look at the next series. And we're off to Brazil's CBLOL semifinals. We've got Loud versus Furia. This is just so one-sided. Now, I've mentioned it before. All right, series like these are hard to evaluate, given how much we have to just assume if it's either one team really not performing to the level needed, or the other team is just overperforming. In this case, I'm just going to say it. Furia was underperforming. We've seen what a team like them can do to compete. Heck, they did so well against Pain and against every other team in the lower bracket. But the poor draft choices, inability to play towards their win conditions, bizarre positioning and map movement, and the priorities just being all over the place doesn't cut it. Which is a shame because their coordination and vision play were things this team had fairly solid. Now, the second I saw the Quinn top in Game 3, I just had a feeling that the whole thing was doomed. Now, Loud for their side of things, we'll have a chance at the rematch against Pain Gaming. And while I don't think the result will change, this boost of confidence and momentum, might help. It was really unfortunate, but some positives. I really liked how well Loud ballooned the leads. I think they just get a little overzealous, and any team that can catch that will usually punish it and minimize as much as what has been ballooned previously. I think I'm just a little bothered because in this series, it just seemed as if neither team were super proactive. As much as one was just generally less proactive than the other, spending their time to set up for things, and then when one team missteps, there you go. Hopefully, Loud can fix some of their hiccups if they want to qualify for Worlds. Shout out to Brance and Seos, who really outplayed the Furia duo at every moment. Let's take a look at the next series. And we get to the second semifinals of the winners bracket, or the upper bracket of North America's LCS. We've got Cloud9 versus Evil Geniuses, and congrats on Cloud9 being the 10th team to qualify for Worlds. Now, Evil Geniuses hold a lot of solid fundamentals. Good wave manipulation, side lane controls, decent vision play, some solid coordination, questionable decision making here or there, but the main issue lies in where they choose to be proactive. Their drafts primarily focus on small skirmish and wave manipulations, making neutral fights harder to engage on. Cloud9, for their part, have solid draft sense and neutral play that complements this current meta. And as they were much more proactive in this series, it's no wonder that Evil Geniuses found themselves regularly on the back foot. Now, much more proactive doesn't mean proactive enough. Cloud9 looked more prepared to make active moves mid to late game, as Evil Geniuses held a lot of ground early game, and preference for when the proactivity would happen on either team didn't matter when Cloud9 were doing more to get their win conditions unlocked and ready to go. I do think that it's notable that Cloud9, despite their proactivity issues, still had enough going for them to deal with this particular matchup. Evil Geniuses going into the lower bracket and seeing the other three teams there in TSM, Counterlogic Gaming, and Team Liquid, I'm really unsure who comes out on top as the third and last seed of the LCS for the Worlds. But I'm not confident it'll be Evil Genius, given how much more proactive the other three teams are and how they prioritize to get their leads. It really will depend on if Evil Geniuses pivots and adapts towards this current meta properly. Shout out to Jensen and Berserker, who were huge in each skirmish and fight. All eyes were on them. Let's take a look at the next series. All right, we head off to the semifinals of the losers bracket, round 2 of the losers bracket, where we got Fukouka SoftBank Hawks Gaming versus Rascal Jesters in the LJL from Japan. If both teams had played like they did in Game 4, but for the entire series, I would have a very different impression of both of them. In matters of vision, team fighting, neutral setups, and even draft sense, both teams exhibited some form of either shyness or hesitation to the approach. And in some cases, just inability to perform the drafts like their compositions that they draft. And while I do acknowledge that these issues do disappear by the time Game 4 rolls around, it looked like the winner of the series was going to be the team that got their shit together first, which so happened to be the Hawks. Now, to their credit, the Hawks do know what their win conditions are and how to close out games once they are there, but whether they know how to get to their win conditions is rather inconsistent. The Jesters, for their part, seemed to be on the ball faster when it came to the drafts, but not as much on executing them either. I also appreciate that both teams, even if sloppily, did put active attention to the side lane pressure while trying to make moves around the map. But the lack of consistent application to their drafts, the very poor positioning, and overall bizarre decisions on occasions means that the team who's just slightly faster to the draw comes out the victor, which in this case just so happens to be the Hawks. And from this, it doesn't give me any confidence that either of these teams would even do well against Sengoku Gaming. Shout out to Dasher for his fancy footwork, and Marvel, who kept up damage as much as possible in the chaos of a lot of these fights. Take a look at the next series. And we're off to Vietnam in the VCS's upper bracket semifinals. We've got Saigon Buffaloes versus GEN.G Esports, also known as the Marines. And congratulations to the Buffaloes on being the 11th team to qualify for Worlds. And I would not be surprised if GEN.G were to follow right after. Both teams have styles that complement each other to make an interesting series. While both have excellent vision, GEN.G is a little bit more defensive, while the Buffaloes are more river-focused. They both have opportunities to show that they play with aggressive vision, but that tends to be their, go-to. Both are proactive, but the Buffaloes focus on neutral control, while GEN.G focus on wave manipulations and flanking. This leads to moments where one team would make a proactive move for just the other to contest or answer elsewhere, and then they switch positions where the other one is proactive and then the other has to contest. It was very nice, and the pace of these games never stopped, rarely ever being in the hand of one or the other for very long. I think that the Buffaloes drafted more consistent to their style, while GEN.G had a lot more flexibility within their drafts, but not always really leaning into their play style overall. And looking at this particular series, and I'm comparing Team Secret, who was just waiting in the lower bracket, they wouldn't even fare properly against GEN.G or the Marines, who would be it would just be hard. Because of the two of the series, GEN.G is the more aggressive and consistently proactive, sometimes to their detriment when uncoordinated. I would always give them the edge. And it's just really unfortunate. Now, and despite their loss for GEN.G, it mostly played onto the backs of who had the better execution when they held control, and the Buffaloes won out and were a lot more consistent giving that part. Still, I'm of the impression that the Marines will join the Buffaloes as the second rep for the VCS at Worlds. It's just a matter of formality. Shout out to BeanJ and Shogun, who during laning phase and team fights really maximized any and every lead the Buffaloes could get. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of China's LPL with JD Gaming versus Top Esports. Let me readjust. Oh, much better. And as per usual, this series was close and won by the margin of errors at times. Now, Top Esports showing some excellent approaches to neutral objectives and vision control, while JD Gaming do everything to maneuver the map and gain any small advantages and trades that are trade ups. Now, Just in classic LPL sense, nothing is either left uncontested or unanswered somewhere else on the map. Both teams also fall prey to the win early, and everything becomes even in close late game scenario. A little too often, as that is something that's happened 10 for 10 games now between these two teams. Either team becoming first seed for the LPL here would have been justified given how close the series, or both of these series, were. And I'm afraid a little bit that both teams managed to garner a lot of leads early to mid-game, and then it starts to really just fall apart, and that a lot of stronger international teams will take advantage of that in some way. It's a shame, really, because both teams do find creative angles of attack to gain their leads, but often fumble either due to a bad macro trade or a fight is created from a positional error on the international stage that might not fly as well. But from this, I can also see both of these teams making the semifinals because of how they're proactive and really push the envelope on any given particular situation. So rather playing behind or ahead, they're not going to let go any contest. Honestly, I'm pretty sure that Top Esports could have won this final game if it wasn't for the last fight where Jaculiv was caught out of position in their base. Oh well. Shout out to Hope and Yagao, who managed to create so much space and damage, even while having, for a lot of the games, almost zero additional resources added to their play. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the regional qualifiers, and I still count that as a playoff game. So here we go. We got the LCKs, Damwon Kia versus Liiv Sandbox. And congratulations on Damwon Kia on being the 12th team to qualify for Worlds. Now, what happens when you never let Liiv Sandbox fight on their terms? Well, it's what Damwon Kia did to succeed against Liiv Sandbox. It was super simple. You just played the side lanes better. Liiv Sandbox have a hyper focus on team fighting, and when they don't have the tools at the right time, they falter, either from poor flank setups or poor lack of awareness of flanks, the level differences, or the straight up gold difference that would exist. And that really comes as Dove being the weak link in this setup. Having Nuguri be the stronger of the two laners made a huge impact on how Liiv Sandbox were able to perform. Because outside of that, Liiv Sandbox have solid drafts, and both teams play vision just as well as the other, and they both have similar proactive plays and poor judgment calls as to when they need to fight. Damwon Kia, for their part, recognized the weakness in Liiv Sandbox, and yet still found it incredibly hard to just play out the late game and close out huge decisive leads. A weakness that, for years now, this was so well documented, will be just equally heavily punished as we head into Worlds. Is like, no team is going to let them get away with mindlessly playing out the late game, lost and confused. I can't find a way how you would garner such a huge lead with no Flame Horizon and then some, and not be able to close out games with like an 8 to 10k gold lead. Now, otherwise, a lot of the weaker teams at Worlds are not going to know how to deal with the early game snowball that Damwon is accustomed to, which is just par for the course. Now, shout out to Showmaker, who created a lot of space in these fights, and to Nuguri, who, again, was the difference maker in this series. Let's take a look at the next one. It's the Southeast Asians PCS's winners finals with CTBC Flying Oysters versus Megabank Beyond Gaming in the Battle of the Banks. And congratulations to the Flying Oysters on being the 13th team to qualify for Worlds. This was a bizarre series, to say the least. Beyond Gaming, for their part, are consistent in their team fighting, vision play, and drafts, but when it comes to macro movements and side lane advantages, or even team fighting, they lose out to the Flying Oysters. and not from a lack of trying either. For a moment, it would look like a back and forth series, especially within the first 2 games, but Game 3 rolls around, and it shows that once Beyond Gaming fall behind, they find it harder and harder to come back, regardless of how proactive they are. The Flying Oysters, on the other hand, are also bizarre. A little inconsistent with vision, but excellent around neutral objectives and side lane play, which really necessitates solid vision work. And best of all, however, their coordination around team fighting is solid, but not necessarily around map movement and trying to make any particular plays. They also know exactly how to play while ahead, properly ballooning leads and applying pressures in ways that make it incredibly hard to approach them, harder than usual even. The decision-making when behind, however, is another story. To extra emphasize their lack of coordination on macro movement, while behind it becomes a compounding issue. Sometimes I did notice the Flying Oysters, when trying to close, are excellent, but slow. Almost as if a little reserved and hesitant to close it out until certain, which is not to be confused with some teams who don't know how to close altogether. Beyond Gaming have another chance to qualify for Worlds, but I'm not super confident they'll make it. Uncertain. Shout out to Mission and Rest, who have been excellent at setting up the team for success during these team fights. Let's take a look at the next series. And we're into the semifinal losers of the North American LCS. We've got Team Liquid versus Counterlogic Gaming. To be a CLG fan is never a good time. Now, as a CLG fan, there is nothing more poetic than getting your hopes up and then being disappointed completely. Now, that said, the series was super interesting on how both teams play out their series respectively. Because on paper, both have solid vision and early game application, really excellent at playing out leads, while struggling a little bit to answer while behind, solid coordinated team fights while ahead, while being a little disjointed when behind. Both teams excel at early game approach and only work as a team if they are ahead, otherwise most of their games just kind of fall apart. What's really fascinating to me watching this series and watching all of the other ones these two teams have played is that this isn't a game-to-game aspect, because either team moving on for me would have been fine from a game-to-game aspect. Yes, even with my CLG bias, even if Team Liquid lost and CLG went so on the direction, I'm pretty okay with Team Liquid moving on. But as a series as a whole, how is it that Counterlogic Gaming are really strong right out the gate, but lose steam as more games pass, and Team Liquid take 1 to 2 games to get going before really finding their stride? Honestly, I prefer CLG's situation, but not by much, as it leads to this being the 3rd reverse sweep of the summer playoffs. Now, as Team Liquid moves on, and I'm looking at Evil Geniuses and Team Solo Mid, and I'm not a big fan of who the prospective 3rd team is for the LCS. Team Liquid look like the strongest contenders, depending on how the other series shows, but they need to show strong play right out the gate in their series, or it doesn't look like they'll be having a good time at Worlds. Now, shout out to Santorin and Bjergsen, who do a lot of work to get the team in a solid position for any of the given team fights. Let's take a look at the next series. It's what I would call the lowest of low brackets for any of these regions. It's the regional qualifier, the first one, where we've got Edward Gaming International versus Royal Never Give Up in our 4th reverse sweep. And congrats to Edward Gaming on being the 14th team to qualify for Worlds. And also to get the chance to defend your title. Now, game 1 and 2, Edward Gaming, whack. Games 3 to 5, Edward Gaming, awesome. or the Royals were somewhat inconsistent, or were somewhat consistent in terms of macro choices, vision play, side lane controls, and so on, allowing us a purview of consistency across the board. The consistency disappears as we head to the mid to late game stages, as they really fumble neutral objective options. Edward Gaming, for their part, looked incredibly lost and incapable of proving why they were top 3 in the upper playoff brackets. Then Game 3 rolls around, and the awful vision play becomes darn near perfect. The map movement that was questionable becomes more consistent and cohesive. The team fighting, my God, is it ever so nice to see a team use vision and map movement to gain advantages even while behind. And that's just the thing. They didn't become perfect. From Game 3, they still had the same kinds of issues where some priorities made no sense from Edward Gaming, but they became more recognizable as the same team that made it to the double elimination portion of the playoffs. And terrifying still. And awesomely, they were always looking for an avenue on how to regain leads and push the leads that they had harder. And the other tier 1 and 2 teams from any other international region should be worried, because this is now the tier 3 seed for the LPL. The Royals, with this kind of form, look okay, but given the performance that LNG showed, I'm starting to think that the MSI champs are not going to go to Worlds. Shout out to JJ and Scout, who really created so much space for every team fight angle to work. Let's take a look at the next series. We're in the LCK's lowest of the low regional finals brackets, with DRX versus KT Rolsters, and I don't know what to tell you about this series. Honestly, KT had a lot going for them. Incredible early game, fantastic vision and neutral play, solid coordination while ahead. What they don't have, right, is consistent late game macro choices or even consistent drafts. The drafts especially feel insulting in some sense. The worst part is KT is a cut above DRX roll for roll and should have won the first game and gotten a 3-0. Or at least that was the expectation. And I think that expectation got to their heads as late game approaches and they become lazy or uncoordinated, or as the drafts further into the series become erratic, allowing just DRX easier to execute compositions. Overall, allowing DRX to play a style in which they can come out on top is just kind of unacceptable, really, because their style is like, DRX have good vision occasionally and poor vision regularly, inconsistent neutral setups and side lane control, and awkward positioning for any skirmishes. But they at least adapted and found so many chances to succeed in this series. But it's one of those things where you don't force mistakes, you just let mistakes happen and then you win. Watching this, I'm convinced that neither of these teams would have won against Liiv Sandbox. And if the previous series of DRX versus Liiv Sandbox had any indication of what's to come next, I don't think the rematch will have a different result. Shout out to Juhan, who subbed in and did a whole lot more than Piosik could, and Kingen, who was the most consistent member of the team. Let's take a look at the next series. And it's the semifinals of the Japanese LJLs with Sengoku Gaming versus Fukuoka SoftBank Hawks Gaming. It was interesting. It's really weird to watch a series where one team spends a lot of time practicing regimented plays and map movement, and the other lives by pure chaos and skill checks. Now, the Hawks show fantastic vision and neutral play, solid side lane controls, and otherwise excellent draft sense. The issue here lies in the mid to late game stages of the game, where it is clear that they are rushing through plays without properly accounting for the tools that are available for both sides, leaving them in rather tricky spots. Or even in the early game, when they make very elaborate level 1 plays, or even answers to the other play, and with minimal gain to speak of. Blank really spent a lot of time investing in trying to disrupt anything that would be coming out of coming from his opponent, and it just left it with like mostly nothing. It's a lot of dissatisfaction, which was super interesting just to see how Once would just react. But honestly, I don't think it was worth the pain. That said, they sure leveled up from the last series. The thing here, though, is that Saigon Gaming contested and checked for any mistakes that the Hawks, leading them to lose. Saigon Gaming, for their part, mostly played reactive. They have strong early game and laning phases, really leaning into the win lane, win game sentiment, but otherwise it is fairly autopilot and skill checks from there. This doesn't help when a team has fairly inconsistent vision, unless ahead, and takes very little time to set up any of their plays. A team like this, proactive, I could see making worlds and making moves, but the lack of proactivity makes it hard for me to see where this team could go. Shout out to Once, who really established early game control, and Jet, who played out of his mind to zone control the Hawks in chaotic ways. Take a look at the next series. It's the semifinals of the Oceania's LCO. We've got Pentanet.GG versus Order on a rematch that doesn't go usually how most rematches go. I mean, it's rare to see rematches go one-sided, but from the loser hitting back. In this situation, Order just kind of looked lost, rarely having the vision to make any plays, not addressing either team's win conditions, rushed neutrals, lack of coordination, and just overall a lot of passivity from them. There's an aspect here that would make it seem like Pentanet had a huge upgrade of some sort, and honestly, it's not really. It doesn't look that way. Pentanet found the time to have some solid vision control and applied the win conditions consistently. They had more coordination, and the recipe for this particular series is done. Their wave manipulation, however, was fairly excellent. All of this was really bizarre because, honestly, from Pentanet, their drafts are much harder to execute overall, but they didn't really have to execute it or do even a lot to get to the point where they were hitting any win condition. Order, with their much simpler drafts, had the priority to be proactive and assure the scaling for their teams functioned in their favor, but instead looked like most of the team just kind of woke up today and gave up. Just straight up gave up. Given that, I would say it's kind of hard to tell if Pentanet will do well against the Chiefs. And possibly, but like, given how little they actually played to their win condition, like Pentanet didn't have to do very much to their win conditions. They were just given extra win conditions. I don't think they will do well against the Chiefs. Right? I'm not very optimistic from that. And I'm, especially since I don't think the Chiefs would allow them to have what they happened today. Shout out to Falcon and Pradith, who had such solid performances overall, especially in the smaller skirmishes of the game. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the losers it's like the losers quarterfinals. It's like the before the semifinals, the quarterfinals. It's the quarterfinals of the Southeast Asians PCS with Paris Saint-Germain Talons versus Deep Cross Gaming. It was an interesting matchup, I gotta say the least. Honestly, if you give the Talons 30 minutes and a dream, they'll win anything. Which is a shame, because if they are too far behind, they don't do anything. Good thing they were up against Deep Cross because they can just wait and they'll stop doing anything at 30 minutes. These two teams are foils of each other, where the Talons have great vision control but shoddy vision denial. Deep Cross have great vision denial but shoddy vision control, where Deep Cross play very lane-centric, the Talons play very macro-oriented, and the issue here is I think that neither team would do well at Worlds. Just if either of these teams qualified for Worlds, I wouldn't think of it of them doing anything. And at this point, it's a shame because the biggest change is how would Deep Cross get better at closing out games, and how would the Talons get better at being proactive during the early game? If somehow the Talons make the adjustment for their series against Beyond Gaming, then we might have a solid team going into Worlds. But as far as I can see right now, we have teams who have coordination in just one stage of the game, and at any other, they are either disjointed at best or far too behind the pace at worst. I have a feeling that the Talons will take the second slot at Worlds, but that's mostly looking at the matchup with Beyond Gaming, who likely won't be able to keep up with the late game pressure that the Talons show, which, to be fair, the Talons show an excellent late game approach. I just wish that it matched the rest of the game. Shout out to Unified and Gory, who were hallmarks of the success they managed late game. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the semifinals for the Vietnamese VCS. We've got KANGA Esports versus Team Secret. And congratulations to GAM on being the 15th team to qualify for Worlds. No one should be surprised. You'd be hard-pressed to think that that there was going to be any other result for this series. But Secret did surprise me in the first half of Game 1, where Team Secret had more consistent vision, stronger draft, and a proper approach to the win condition. The second they started misplaying by the late stage of Game 1 is when it started to get worse from then during. And then as that happened for the series, it just got better for GAM across the series. Now, Team Secret had a sense of cohesion, but as the series went on, the team had weaker vision play, sloppy dives, and teamfight approaches, and just began walking in a line to just get killed instead of playing around GAM's slower early game. Now, GAM still show proactivity overall and an incredible understanding of the limits of their draft, and I found myself very mesmerized, oftentimes not even typing when they approach neutral objectives. The level of coordination to find the vision setup, start the objective, secure it, turn, all in one swift, synchronized motion, like a machine almost, is something really to behold, which is a shame because that's not the team we saw against the Buffaloes or even in Game 1 of this series. But given the slow buildup that GAM had across for the summer season, it's not surprising if coming this finals against the Buffaloes, they, for their rematch series, no matter on top of it, they would turn it around. Because at this moment, the way they played out this series, they look unstoppable. Shout out to Katsi and Levy, who controlled the early game tempo and zoning of all of the fights. Let's take a look at the next series. We're back to Europe with LEC's round 2 of the lower bracket. We've got Fnatic versus Misfits Gaming. And congratulations to Fnatic on being the 16th team to qualify for Worlds. And a moment's silence to Misfits, who played their last game as an organization. Alright, moment's done. There is nothing more certain than death, taxes, and Fnatic making it to Worlds. Fnatic sped run through this entire series with a clear understanding of where they wanted to put their win conditions and how to get there. Misfits, for their part, did not look prepared to confront the aggression brought to them. That said, Fnatic was not efficient and often found themselves to be overzealous, cocky, leading to wild and chaotic fights that Misfits took full advantage of. And when Misfits had control of the tempo, and of a lead even, they navigated the map in fairly excellent ways. The issue really comes from the hesitation and limitation of the drafts that they put up. Neon is still the main focus, and if he wasn't ahead in some way, then Misfits still struggled to get around any of the proper priorities. Fnatic were incredibly entertaining with how they outmaneuvered, but this looked like a case of that they could do it this way because the plan of attack specifically targeted Misfits' weaknesses outright. And if Fnatic play to attack the weaknesses of Mad Lions on their next series, then this should be fun. And if it's just them playing fast and loose out of a skill check, then I have concern for their prospect at Worlds, really. It's an unfortunate situation that this is the series that Misfits have to leave their mark. But one hell of a mark it was. Shout out to Razark and Wonder, who really outmaneuvered all of Misfits. Let's take a look at the next series. All right. We're back to North America with the lower bracket, where we've got Evil Geniuses versus Team Solo Mid. And I hate saying this, but like, as a fairly big TSM hater, I still preferred the way that they approached the game, especially over Evil Geniuses. Now that said, Team Solo Mid were still inconsistent with the approach. They had stronger vision, side lane controlled, stronger neutral approach, and excellent drafting. But that doesn't matter in situations where they only work when ahead in golden tempo. When Team Solo Mid play ahead, it spoils and riches, but when behind, they're caught in a drought of doing nothing at all. Evil Geniuses, for their part, were significantly more proactive on the plays, but the vision is usually shallow, and their drafts force them into significantly harder to play scenarios than needed. Team Solo Mid looked like they did their homework, while Evil Geniuses play like they just so happened to own the answer card to the test, and yet still doesn't follow the answers. Evil Geniuses regularly drafted compositions with win conditions that they just wouldn't lean into, and just so you know, that's a lot of 1-3-1 drafts just to ignore the side lanes completely and just really attack the mid lane just as an ARAM. Like, why draft side lane control if you're not going to use them to control the side lanes? From what I see here, I'm not particularly a fan of the possible third team the LCS is going to be sending for Worlds. Between Evil Geniuses' drafting choices and how they avoid playing them properly, and Team Liquid needing to warm up 2 games in their series, it's not looking super good for the third seed of the LCS. Shout out to Inspired and Impact, who held a lot of control and sway in the top half of the map and the jungle. Take a look at the next series. We're back to China's LPL in the regional qualifiers, the lowest of the lowest low brackets and playoffs. We've got LNG Esports versus Victory 5 or V5. And honestly, like, LNG are an enigma. On paper, they shouldn't be able to make this miracle run, and yet, here we are. V5 had more consistent vision play, significant better neutral setups, and overall better coordination, asterisk. But the clutch factor from LNG is too strong, from always playing the limits of the side lane control to the absolute dedication to move forward on any play, regardless of how messy it could be. And the team fights being so even from both teams across the board are an absolute joy to watch in this series. I think what really makes the clutch factor for LNG so strong is their ability to minimize loss efficiently, to be fully prepared on the next play. so often do some of the members stop to disengage whenever a bad play comes in to give a lot of time for carries to escape, or spend an extended amount of time to poke and delay victory 5 so that even when, they may lose an objective or any particular play, they can be prepared for the next one much faster. V5, for their part, had the unfortunate nature of, regardless of how good they were across the board, of needing 2 games to warm up before hitting that mark that we recognized them in. And this time, as opposed to other teams who take that time to warm up in a series, they came up short in game 4. No matter how good you look in a series, if you take 2 games to get there, it's not great. Any small particular mistake is going to cost you. Now, whether LNG's clutch factor comes up big against the Royals, who are rather hungry to get to Worlds, is really up in the air, because on paper, no, the Royals should have this easy. In application, well, let's see, it's really up to LNG. Shout out to Ala and Doinby, who created so much space and opportunities for the team to play their style. Take a look at the next series. It's the last playoff series for the LCK in Korea. We've got DRX versus Liiv Sandbox in a stunning turn of events. Congratulations to DRX, who are the 17th team to qualify for Worlds. Result, literally no one expected. Liiv Sandbox had such a strong early game approach and solid coordination, but, somehow were super inconsistent coming into today's matchup. Looking back at the previous series these two teams played against each other, it was clear that Liiv Sandbox outmaneuvered and outfought DRX at any given turn, but over here in this one, the Sandbox fumble draft choices. They fumble an entire game. They allow DRX the full flexibility to play how they want at the pace that they want for 0 extra cost. Now, DRX, for their part, put in Pheonix for some reason in one game, and it didn't do very much for them. But once Juhan is in, it's just like the team is completely transformed. Early game is proactive and engaged. This version is just a lot more consistent, and when ahead, they don't lose pressure around the map, a issue that they regularly had with the previous version of this roster. The sub made a huge difference, as neutral fights in early jungle skirmishes were the make or break of any given game within this series. The one thing that leaves me a little concerned is how the pace of the game is so slow for DRX. Many of the other teams going into Worlds will be playing at such a breakneck speed that DRX may never get the chance to play their style. But the style of side lane controls and zoning teams out of neutral objectives is a fairly good look for them. Shout out to Juhan, who is a lifesaver for this team, and Kingen, who really outmaneuvered Dove for map pressure and really enabled this side lane control win condition for them. Let's take a look at the next series. It's Southeast Asia's PCS's semifinals. We've got Megabank Beyond Gaming versus Paris Saint-Germain Talons in a very close, stylistically similar situations. Congratulations to Beyond Gaming on being the 18th team to qualify for Worlds. They almost threw it, allowing themselves in a situation in which the Talons were poised to reverse sweep them. Instead, they remained firm in their approach towards vision, side lane control, and neutral skirmishes, all fairly excellent. The thing, however, is that both teams here hold similar approaches to the game, and regardless of who won between the two, I don't think the final results or the finals results will change. I don't think either team would do better against the Flying Oysters. The only difference here is that the talents seem less coordinated and require a lot more time to ramp up at a series, which is not great. Both teams also have fairly lack proactivity around the mid to late game. Early game, their proactivity is fine. There's a lot of approaches that they work with here that are fairly excellent, but once that's finished, they shake hands and opt to let the other side scale, which is kind of ridiculous given the kinds of drafts that they would give each other, which is purposefully scaling. The leads accrued early game, guys, need to go somewhere, but instead, either team would be instead of either team doing something about it, it was just a matter of time where one team made a mistake first and then capitalize on it. Beyond Gaming being the exception sometimes, which made a lot of difference in this matchup. Hopefully, the strange pacing that this team provides can be fixed before they head to Worlds, or they won't be having a great time. Shout out to Husha and Likai, who purposely created a whole lot of space during some of these team fights in a way that didn't let the Talons breathe or approach them. Let's take a look at the next series. We head off into the upper bracket semifinals for Europe's LEC, where we've got G2 versus Rogue. And God, G2, what a terrifying team. G2 find ways to keep tempo control no matter their position. Solid vision, excellent team fight coordination, smart map movement. They've got everything and anything you want in a particular team at this moment. The whole package. I think their drafts and overconfidence will get punished when they head to Worlds, but right now, no team seems to know how to handle them in the LEC. I like seeing games like this because even the slower ones, G2 can show what a low-kill, high proactive team looks like. It's not about just getting kills themselves or doing like gank plays. It's about how you collect resources that matters, more than just waiting for neutrals to spawn and either expect a fight or just securing it without contest. G2 right now show me that they look like a top 4 teams at Worlds, especially if they keep up this kind of form in their next series in the finals for the LEC. Rogue, for their part, looked mostly lost, disorganized, and uncoordinated, especially during team fights. The first few minutes in the early game for them are pretty well planned out, and they have a solid idea of what their win conditions are, but the lack of proactivity really hurt, especially against a team like G2, who, when you just let them have control of the tempo, really run away with it. Rogue will have a chance to avoid play-ins at Worlds in their next series, but like if the lack of proactivity stays as it is, then it might be really rough for them. Shout out to Targamas and Caps, who really manipulated the team fights in rather dizzying ways. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the Brazilian CBLOL's grand finals and a rematch 2-in-1 combo. I love these. Where we've got Loud versus Pain Gaming. And congratulations to Loud on being the 19th team to qualify for Worlds. Where in the previous time these two teams have met, I had mentioned that Loud was a lot more consistent as a team, but super indecisive, and that Pain was inconsistent but decisive to a fault. Well, for Pain, that seems to have disappeared as the confidence from them was nowhere to be seen, and the coordination from Loud was in full force this time, and decisively. Better at the setups for neutrals, stronger approach to team fights, a lot more active in the mid game, solid vision play. Of all the teams that the CBLOL is sending, I'm glad actually that it's Loud, and in the version that we see them in the finals. I'm hoping that this decisiveness of the squad stays, because they'll still have to work on their proactivity. In the early game, it needs quite a bit of work. They do incredibly well to set up their win conditions and do have the tools necessary for any given neutral fights, but those are usually done as a response to their opponents who are regularly first there, or they're answering a play on the other side of the map. Once mid-game rolls around, they're more proactive and coordination and consistency shines through regarding that. But the teams at Worlds won't give them the chance to passively play out the laning phase like they did here, or even just to answer. Loud bring a solid, consistent style from the CBLOL, and it should be fantastic to watch at Worlds, who are used to a lot more wild and chaotic version of the Brazilian league. Shout out to Seos and Robo, who continuously disrupted all angles of attack that Pain had to offer. Let's take a look at the next series. We're off in North America's LCS's upper bracket semifinals. We've got Cloud9 versus 100 Thieves. And Cloud9 show us that patience can be a strong tool against a team that make quick, unflinchingly bad decisions. In this situation, the Thieves usually show, or usually have at least stronger vision play, neutral setup, team fight coordination, not by a whole lot, not by much, but it's there. That advantage for them is there. What Cloud9 does, or at least what they excel in, is the macro decision making. So often, 100 Thieves would have either like a stronger control of the map, better draft, gold lead, and a Drake lead, and then make a bafflingly bad decision that just leaves them in a lose-lose scenario. Meanwhile, Cloud9 will find any minute disadvantage to keep trading up, and once they have a significant lead, they do so much work to suffocate the Thieves. And Cloud9 will avoid taking straight up fights against them because they know that they're not the stronger team for it. They instead just stack any given particular favor, like any particular situation in their favor like no tomorrow. Cloud9 are a fascinating team to watch from series to series. Seeing how they adapt themselves to their opponents, I just worry a little bit that they don't hold enough proactivity, as much of their play was still on the back of how 100 Thieves played in the same way that all of their other games were. Now that said, the Thieves have such a simple course correction for themselves. And just to be a fantastic thing, it's really down to either fixing their macro decisions and or drafting choices so that they can take something that fits within their style. With that, I could see the Thieves coming back to the finals and win a potential rematch against Cloud9. Shout out to Jensen and Blabber, who created so many small advantages that led to the stacked team fights in their favor. Take a look at the next series. It's the last lot for the Chinese LPL region. Into the last regional qualifier, we've got Royal Never Give Up versus LNG Esports, and congratulations on the Royals on keeping up a fine tradition of every MSI champion qualifying for Worlds, on being also the 20th team to qualify for Worlds. And I'm not going to lie here, I probably would have preferred that LNG qualified though. But the fact of the matter is that one team was proactive early game while the other one is proactive late game, and that's pretty much my only difference in what I prefer. Even if I rather the early game team to go, if they can't carry over that momentum to the late game, then it doesn't really matter how much of a lead they got. Whenever LNG play flawlessly, they look near unstoppable, while the Royals look like they are taking a step back and rolling over. But when the Royals look great, it's just them going through the motions of a solid, standard League of Legends. Both teams play with fantastic vision approaches, side lane approaches, and I only slightly prefer the Royals' approach to neutrals as it's less risky. And that's the key word here in this series, is that the Royals take less risks. So their proactivity is subtle and slow, while teams like LNG are going to really push the envelope with tempo and momentum. The lower-seeded teams, going into Worlds at least, will have a lot to contend with against the Royals, as this team really sets the bar for what's expected in this tournament. If you can beat the Royals at Worlds, you're likely to make bracket stage. Otherwise, most of the other top teams you'll have an incredibly rough time against. And that's just it, right? They're the gold standard for this. So, shout out to Wei and Xiaohu, who controlled the tempo of any given team fight, really routing LNG right where they want them, and likely about to do the same to a lot of emerging regions. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of the Japanese LJL. We got Detonation Focus Me versus Sengoku Gaming in another finals rematch. But this was not even close. Just not even close. Congratulations on Detonation Focus Me on being the 21st team to qualify for Worlds. This was so utterly one-sided. While early game Sengoku Gaming shows some signs of coordinations and proactivity that's really nice to look, or nice to see at least from them, it is clear that Detonation are in full control. Whatever led to Sengoku Gaming whatever lead that Sengoku Gaming would gain at first would be instantly lost by all laning phase advantages that are being accrued and set up by Detonation. Every decision served to make the team as a whole gain gold, while Sengoku Gaming would primarily focus on getting Jet ahead or getting some neutrals, but not building off of that. And also, just Jet would not hold any meaningful impact, and with the neutrals being tied so much later into the game, it is on top of the fact that Sengoku Gaming never held a gold lead during the entire series. The mid game comes around and breaks, the mid game comes around, and the breaks just don't exist for Detonation Focus Me, as any small advantage is being pushed by them and any fight is taken. They have this nasty little habit of going a little too aggro on any given play, but given how Sengoku Gaming didn't know how to respond to anything being thrown at them, it didn't usually matter. This could become an issue against higher seeded teams at Worlds, who will gladly fight them on those terms, but given the context of this series, it didn't matter. Seeing the absolute confidence out of Detonation Focus Me and the fact that they did not throw once during the playoff series at this given moment has me hopeful about their performance at Worlds against some of the most emerging regions and some of the lower seeded teams of legacy regions. Really going to be nice. Shout out to Yudapon and Yaharang, who were monster carries during the entire series. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of the Oceanic LCO. We've got the Chiefs versus Pentanet GG. And it wasn't quite as one-sided as expected. But congrats to the Chiefs on being the 22nd team to qualify for Worlds. If you looked at every game that the Chiefs played, you might think perfect team with solid execution, incredibly good vision play, solid team fight coordination, patient setup around neutrals, and good draft sense. And for the most part, you'd be right. But then, Pentanet comes along and shows the secret to the world. The Chiefs play mostly not to lose, instead of playing to win. Primarily in the early game, at least. And it seems that the Chiefs have a serious lack of proactivity in the early game that causes this. That only really kicks in once the mid to late game, or once the mid game has rolled around. And only if they so happen to have a lead. Pentanet really showed that the Chiefs have incredibly strong laners who rely on the fact that they're this good at laning phase to get by in the early game and accumulate leads just from laning phase alone and not much else. And while their mid to late game is incredibly solid, heading to Worlds, they won't get away with just being strong laners, as the caliber of the players are going to be incredibly high. Now, that's it again. The vision and neutral skirmishes are something to behold from the Chiefs. And while it isn't consistent, the Chiefs do play some interesting map movements and side lane control to create confusion and separation from their opponents. Which leads to the team fighting overall, which is really out of this world. A lot of team fighting teams are going to Worlds, and I can 100% see the Chiefs going toe-to-toe with them. The instant coordinated engages and layering of abilities is a sight to behold and is really fun to see. And we're going to get a chance to see it on the international stage. Shout out to Raze and Tally, who are really the big fars of how the Chiefs play their modus operandi. Let's take a look at the next series. We've got ourselves the Southeast Asian PCS Grand Finals and a rematch with the big bank battle. We got CTBC Flying Oysters versus Megabank Beyond Gaming. And this is even more one-sided than the times these teams met previously. I think this is a necessary statement for the Flying Oysters to show that come hell or high water, they are strong competitors for the group stage. At moments, it seemed like the Flying Oysters would lose from being over-aggressive, but regardless of how many lost fights there were, or how many lost fights there were just in early game, and primarily only in the early game, the Flying Oysters would garner even more leads across the map. In the impressive feats of total control from the first ban to the disrespectful fountain dive at Game 3, the Flying Oysters tell the world that they have a solid foundation with laning, vision play, neutral objectives, side lane, and wave manipulation, and most of all, individual as well as team fight coordination. Beyond Gaming, for their part, seemed incredibly disjointed and lost. They have solid vision play and neutral approach, but in matters of team fighting, laning, or even proactivity, they were just a cut below the Flying Oysters. I don't have strong confidence from Beyond Gaming that they'll be incredibly competitive in play-ins, having a hard time to deal with other teams with similar styles as the Flying Oysters, but they do have strong knack on how to answer plays and punish over aggression. They keep proactive even while behind, and that is an angle I can appreciate heading into the world stage where proactivity from ahead or behind is necessary, even if they weren't as strong as the Flying Oysters in that proactivity. It seems like the PCS is sending in some strong representatives heading into Worlds, and it'll be a blast to see this new kind of style from the region. Shout out to Rest and Gemini, who caused so many issues for Beyond Gaming in their hopes to contest any early game advantages. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of the Vietnamese VCS and another rematch, but this time it's utterly one-sided. Holy shit. We've got GEN.G Esports versus Saigon Buffaloes, and it is night and day for GAM, as their approach to the game has seemingly changed overnight, where once there was this very side lane focus to the game, has now become a direct attack on how the Buffaloes approach theirs usually. Full Drake control was the MO. Not a single Drake was uncontested, and only one across all three games were lost. GAM knew how to play side lanes, and it was just a matter of scaling that became an issue for them, and they adjusted that right away. And once it was solved by really focusing on the Drakes for this series, it was just about being more coordinated and better at the setup. And GAM showed some of the strongest neutral setup for the early game that I have seen so far out of the teams that have qualified for Worlds. And the Buffaloes the entire time seemed rather lost and confused as to how to approach the series. Previously, the Buffaloes attacked GAM on their lack of attention towards neutrals, and once that was shown to no longer be the case from them, the Buffaloes were slow to adapt and even slower to answer any play that was put up in front of them. This is slightly concerning heading into Worlds, where many of the play-in teams are very neutral team fight oriented and or play rather flexibly, and the lack of flexibility will be a large factor going into the tournament. And mind you, these two teams are solid under all accounts regarding vision, team fighter approach and everything else. But with 5, maybe 6 teams who look like they were strong contenders to go on to the group stage from play-ins, any slow adaptation means 0 luck to get to that stage of the competition, let alone be competitive within groups. Honestly, really gonna be rough. Shout out to Cuddy and Style, who really navigated the space and maximized their damage. It was really fascinating to watch how they played up those team fights. Let's take a look at the next series. Round 3 of the lower bracket in Europe's LEC, we've got Fnatic versus Mad Lions. What about that game 1? Of all the ways that Fnatic put up a statement that they should be feared, the 19 minutes and 32 second game is for sure one of them. That game, however, is emblematic of the good and bad that comes from this squad. Fnatic have a very well coordinated effort for vision, dives, neutrals, and team fights. Super clean. Asterisk. Once someone is in, they're all in. And as great as that is, it's clear that the second that one person is a little out of line and their opponent is going to punish them, they're just going to double down, though. And that can make it even worse. This kind of play is great when super ahead, but while behind, it just makes the games end faster for teams who have a lot of proactivity themselves. Which leads us to the slow to act but quick to react Mad Lions. Mad is a more consistent with solid vision and wave manipulation kind of team, but they can't really keep up with Fnatic, who are a team that has 0 breaks overall. The level of proactivity that Fnatic has dwarfed whatever Mad could do to respond for it in situations where Fnatic were far ahead. Which doesn't help that Mad is a much slower team overall, because this kind of consistency that they showed us usually comes at the cost of a lot of proactivity, especially when behind. Both of these teams show problems that are going to be very easily exploited come Worlds unless they find ways to course correct. Mad with the lack of proactivity early in, and Fnatic with overcommitting so harshly. The faster teams are going to have their way with Mad, and the clean, measured, proactive teams are going to be more consistently punishing Fnatic for their approach. Shout out to Upset and Razark, who played so excellently in the early and late games to navigate so many of these fights. It's really nice. Take a look at the next series. It's it's like the quarterfinals in the lower bracket of North America's LCS, where we've got Evil Geniuses versus Team Liquid. Not so great choices for North America. I'm sorry, North America, this year you don't seem to have great prospects. Anywho, congratulations to Evil Geniuses on being the 23rd team to qualify for Worlds. Honestly, the look of both of these teams did not inspire much confidence for the region. Team Liquid are the more consistent of the two teams, especially in regards to vision, drafting, and side lane pressure. But whenever something needed to be a guarantee, Team Liquid falter, or too slow, or wait for the Geniuses to make a mistake instead of being proactive. Similarly, for Evil Geniuses, who are inconsistent as to when they want to be proactive and apply pressure, but are at least more consistent in regards to how they do team fighting and neutral objective setup. To me, the edge will always go to the team who plans and drafts with proactivity in mind. And while Team Liquid is a little safe for my liking, Evil Geniuses would still regularly overstep and overestimate the leads that they had, allowing Team Liquid to punish quickly and gain so much of what they would have lost based on their very defensive play. I like at least that it didn't take 2 games for Team Liquid to get going, but they still had issues with how they approached the late game. And Evil Geniuses don't require games to warm up in a series, so even if the series did go to 5 games, which it did. Team Liquid was on match point before Evil Geniuses. I do think that Evil Geniuses is still the better choice for NA, but from two choices that are rather rough, it's only slightly better at best. I do think that they'll do great against a lot of the lower-seeded teams going into Worlds, keeping them really on their toes, but the competition at Worlds is really rough this year, as in, like, they're really competitive, like, they're really strong this year, from at least what I've seen from the other 22 teams that have qualified. Shout out to Inspired and Jojo Pune, who really kept their counterparts under control and unable to perform. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the Turkish TCL Grand Finals with Denizbank Istanbul Wildcats versus Fenerbahçe Esports. And congratulations to the Wildcats on being the last team to qualify for Worlds. Honestly, though, I'm very impressed by the miracle run that Fenerbahçe pulled off. Beating the 3rd seed and then the 1st seed, all as things looked bleak for them in every single one of those series. They kept up excellent wave management, solid vision control, and some beautiful coordinated team fighting when they were ahead in gold. Because the main thing here is that their proactivity and macro choices lag far behind their ability to punish mistakes and create winning team fights from nothing. While the Wildcats are incredibly aggressive in the early game, at least there is some proactivity from them. Speaking of, the vision denial and team fighting are solid from the Wildcats, but are often undercut by inconsistent approaches to neutral objectives and vision control, allowing so many opportunities to get punished by their opponents, notably Fenerbahçe, who really pushed the envelope on that. I also think that both teams being rather slow from the mid to late game, relying on neutral spawn timers to dictate the tempo, is a surefire way to allow any other team at Worlds to pounce non-stop on them. The Wildcats have a lot of grit and personality to their play, but I kind of worry that because they coast on early game aggression and strong team fighting, that all other aspects kind of fall short and will hurt them in the long run unless better late game approaches are learned. Doesn't look super great for the TCL this year. Shout out to Holy Phoenix and Saren, who really showed what it looks like to skirmish and team fight like a Wildcat. Let's take a look at the next series. And we head off to Europe's LEC semifinal, where we've got Rogue versus Fnatic. And something really clicked in Rogue and found the secret formula on how to stop Fnatic. The series showed that Fnatic very much relied on their early game strength, and that teams will meet them on that front so that they could excel and balloon that. And honestly, it worked for most of the time. Razor has been the stronger jungler during playoffs, but the adaptation from Malrong to avoid any unnecessary contest and really focus on the solo lanes, especially Odoamne and the Odoamne and Wonder matchup, made a huge difference. And it really helped that the solo laner, or that the laners in general, were really up to task to nullify any attempts from Razork to influence that particular matchup. Both teams had strong vision application, if not slightly shallow at times, and good understanding of neutral setups, but Fnatic lacked the restraint as to when they have to contest something. And when they were really far down in gold and pressure, they even wouldn't attempt any strong contest of some sort. It was really baffling. So, the Fnatic that we saw coming from the lower bracket is still there, especially if Game 1 is any indication. And the fact that they are in the play-in stage for Worlds feels like a formality at best, as those teams should find them incredibly scary. And while Rogue, I don't think, will have the bigger splash on the international stage, what I saw here was some genuine solid adaptation from them, and that right there is the hallmark of a fantastic team ready for Worlds. I just wish they were more consistent with their proactivity, as at times it seems like it's more of like they would more answer to Fnatic's movement than just kind of like apply their own. Or like apply their own like strategies right off the bat. Shout out to Larson and Comp, who controlled the space and deleted so many people during these fights. Holy cow, were they ever so confident in these. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the North American LCS's semifinals. We got 100 Thieves versus Evil Geniuses. And right off the bat, all right, shout out to Kari, who stepped in for some, like from some big shoes on Evil Geniuses and came up super big. Excellent shit. That said, the Thieves really came in with a host of strategies that worked on different levels and were incredibly flexible all around. Both teams are inconsistent in terms of vision and side lane play, but are incredibly solid in terms of team fights and neutral setups. This is a fairly even matchup, which is a shame because these teams draft for side lane setups so often, and it rarely becomes relevant until Baron or Soul has been secured, and that they're so far up in golden tempo at this point that side lane pressure is really easy. And speaking of tempo, right, the pace of all of these 5 games was not dedicated by any of the teams, but by the timers of the neutral objectives, nothing else. None of these teams controlled the tempo of the game, which to me is concerning given how many teams around the world, or at least going to Worlds, have strong tempo control. There's a larger emphasis on upkeeping map pressure, and as good as that is, if all you're doing is allowing your opponent to keep up parity without ballooning gold outside of these neutral team fights, you'll be in for a rough time against some of these teams who don't quit while behind. I can appreciate the measured response that both teams have, though, during these team fights especially, really skirting around the limits as much as possible, which is something a lot of the other teams going into Worlds have trouble dealing with. Overall, either team winning in this series would have done the trick for me. Given the context of the North American scene, they're pretty solid, and Evil Geniuses going into play-ins feel like a formality more than anything else, and they are likely, keyword likely, to make it out of play-ins if they clean things up just a little bit. But there's a lot of good teams in play-ins. Shout out to Closer and Abadage, who control the tempo and space of every fight excellently. These were really solid team fights in this series. Let's take a look at the next series. It's the grand finals of Europe's LEC and also a rematch. I love these so much. Where we've got Rogue versus G2. Holy shit, this series was awesome. Now, everyone thought that Rogue would lose to Fnatic, right? And when they didn't, everybody thought that they would get crushed by G2. Whoever this Rogue is, I like it. Much more consistent around neutrals, a much better early game approach, and better wave manipulation overall. And the flexibility is still there for this team. Now, in situations like this, it's easy to think, well, maybe G2 dropped the ball and Caps couldn't play to his standard. No, not at all. And that's what's so impressive about this. The early game from G2 is on par, if not better than Rogue's at some points. They also have solid approach to neutrals, better vision play overall, and Caps was more on form than ever as he has been the entire playoffs. There's no doubt that the G2 that we've seen previously is still the same team in this series than in the others. We just got a massive upgrade from Rogue. It's also in situations like this, though, that I have to put on my skeptic hat and wonder if Rogue will be able to continue this momentum heading into Worlds. If they do, then fantastic. This team looks like a top 4 team. Otherwise, if we get pre-Fnatic Rogue, we might find ourselves with a team set to face challenges beyond their capabilities, possibly. I'm hoping for the former, as that will make Worlds an interesting event, especially. I do think that Rogue are still a little too passive in the mid game, or at least in the mid to late game, and it allowed G2 to find a lot of chances to regain control during that time. But just from the sheer leads developed early, it usually didn't matter in this series. But it will matter on the international stage. Do keep that in mind. Shout out to Malrang, who really came back to a form. I haven't seen him in a long time. I really liked it. I missed this Malrang. And Comp, who took matters into his own hands to close out every game. It's really nice. And with that, let's take a look at the next series, also the last series of the summer 2022. It's the final series of the summer playoffs. In North America's LCS's, we got the grand final, which is also a rematch. Cloud9 versus 100 Thieves. And holy moly, was this really one-sided. The evolution of Cloud9 is something to behold and incredibly interesting. Momentum is super important going into Worlds, and that is a huge boost to do so, right? While both sides have solid vision play and early neutral approaches, the thing that really kicks it off is the proactivity that Cloud9 has looking for any opening, whether they are ahead or not. The Thieves regularly played drafts that made things difficult for them and wouldn't always play to their win conditions, but it didn't really stop their early games from being excellent regardless if they played for it or not. Once behind, though, it was clear that their drafts would still become an issue if they were not playing to their win conditions just altogether. Cloud9 have a lot to prove from this series. They look like the strongest team from the region, sure, but they also look like the most consistent from the region and with a proper approach to the game. I don't have much confidence that the Evil Geniuses or 100 Thieves will show strong competitive edge against the other teams from the legacy regions. But Cloud9 have the hallmarks to make it out of groups. Not confidently, but, if they continue to play with the limits that they use in team fights, the strong pressure established around neutrals, and the consistent proactive look for anything, that will move the game ahead, because that's just it. Using the proactive play is that Cloud9 is the only team in the LCS that didn't just let the game go into a lull from the mid-game to the late game, making sure their leads meant something, and to avoid relying on neutral timers while still holding strong control of them. We'll see who they end up being drawn with, and if they can make a splash at groups, but otherwise, I may not have strong confidence they'll come out of groups, but they're the most likely team, I find. Shout out to Berserker and Jensen, who together created so much chaos and control for the team fights that 100 Thieves struggled to maneuver. And this is the final series of the summer playoffs. Now we just have to wait for Worlds. Take a look at my YouTube channel. And for those who are already watching the YouTube video, stick around. Damn, that was a journey. That's 94 playoffs, or depending on the region that you were watching, anywhere between 5 to 15 best of fives. If you want to watch from the other regions, or you really want to watch the supercut, on either side, I don't remember which side I'm going to put it on, you can just watch those there. I want to hear your thoughts also on which one of these were your favorite, what teams you think you're going to be rooting for, just anything and everything down below. I'll be again making some videos further down the line, or should have some videos produced further down the line with all of the magic that comes with it. So keep your eyes peeled. And with that, I'll see you all next time for when I do the introductions of all the different teams. Ciao. Thank you all for watching.